Thank you all for being here. We are victims of our own success. We thought we'd get a dozen grad students maybe, but we've got people from all over the world here today. So my name's Rohan Kapitany. Thalia Goldstein is a colleague of mine, and we have been talking about running a SantaCon for a number of years, half as a joke, but recently I changed jobs and I had just enough time to kind of pull this off. Thalia reached out to Candice and Jackie Woolley and Rianne Kok, who will be here in just a minute. And everyone, fortunately, we just found enough time, the same common time, despite our multiple time zones. And we thought this would all be a great idea to, in the first instance, just talk to each other about Santa, because the empirical study of Santa from a psychological point of view is in its infancy, let's say. And we just thought it'd be a really interesting opportunity to put everyone together. And then all of you showed interest as well. So it's just really exciting for that to have happened. So I would like to thank Jackie and Candice and Rianne forthcoming for your time. I hope you get as much out of this as I do. If you are in the Discord, there is a timetable in there. There is a README in there. Do have a look if you can still access that. You should still have fine access to that. We're just not going to be operating in the visual domain there. But otherwise, we're going to kick off pretty soon. But Thalia, did you have any kind of opening remarks you wanted to offer before we jump right in?
Sure. I just wanted to say that I've been so thrilled by the response to the Santa Claus research that Candice and I have been doing, and Jackie and I published a long time ago. And as Rohan and I keep talking about this, and I think the reason is that Santa taps into a few different sort of interesting psychological and cultural phenomena, right? First of all, many people, particularly in the United States, particularly in the Western world, have a personal association from their childhood and remember sort of how Santa Claus was part of their lives. Many parents are also thinking about Santa Claus and the ways in which they're going to introduce and interact with Santa Claus with their children. But then it's also interesting from a cultural phenomena. It's a thing that many businesses and governments and organizations and local communities come together in order to promote and celebrate. And we're certainly going to be hearing about that today. But then from a pure developmental psychology, sort of academic study of cultural evolution perspective, Santa Claus is also this really interesting phenomena because he touches on critical thinking, the line between imagination and fiction, the way in which hyper-local communities versus more global communities promote and think about social interactions, and then, of course, how we play and how we understand development and the way in which kids start to understand their world. So I think Santa has sort of deceptively deep roots when we're thinking about the ways in which we talk about and study him. So yeah, that was what I was gonna say. Rohan, you're on mute.
Great, thank you, Thalia. I'm just responding to an email from Rianne, so hopefully this will resolve. Thalia, she's still looking for a password.
Okay.
But we can pull her in a bit if we need, if need be. So a little bit of a housekeeping just before we kick off. You've all been in Zoom meetings before. You kind of know the rules. We're here to have a good time and to be respectful. There is quite a lot of people in here. So it would be preferable if you only unmute when you're invited to. Please use the chat to ask any of your questions. I will be the primary moderator. So if Thalia is speaking or Candice or Jackie is speaking, they're probably not going to be paying attention to the chat, but I will be. You can send me PMs if you need to, but I will be attempting to moderate and curate the questions for everything. Thalia, would you like to kick us off with the very first talk?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I have made Candice and Jackie and Rohan hosts, so you should be able to admit anybody who comes in late, as well as see sort of all of the behind the scenes stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So my talk today is going to be on work that Candace Mills and I have been conducting for the last few years that is specifically about lying about Santa. Because of course, anytime we're talking about Santa as if he's a real being or as if he actually exists, we are not telling the truth, right? Sorry, spoiler for everyone who's signed on to SantaCon today. And what is really interesting from the perspective when we're thinking about Santa Claus as somebody that we lie about and tell untruths about, is that parents do this in a variety of ways, but also that the broader culture, particularly in the United States, although I know in many other cultures as well, sort of works together to promote and lie about Santa Claus. So just in the last sort of week or so, this picture on the left-hand side here is a magazine that I picked up in the rack at Target, meaning that it was in the same place as all, oh, am I getting a, okay, no. It was in the same place as the news magazines, also the gossip magazines, and note in particular that there's this little red circle here that says, mystery solved, how Saint Nick gets to every child in one night. And the story that's inside the magazine is about antler aerodynamics. Apparently there's something special about the antlers that allows Santa to overcome the laws of aerodynamics and get to every house in one night. So there's this strong cultural push to promote Santa Claus and to get everybody to believe in him as if he's true. Yet at the same time, there's been a considerable amount of sort of hand-wringing in the American media about whether or not it's okay to lie to your children about Santa Claus. So there's stories on NPR, is it okay to lie about Santa and the Tooth Fairy? On Reddit, there are lists and lists from the Reddit server, Am I the Asshole, for lying about Santa or for telling the truth about Santa? Dear Prudence, I saw mommy being Santa Claus, and Candace will lay this out a little bit more in her talk later. Time magazine last year, should you be lying to your kids about Santa? But we don't just lie to our children about Santa Claus. In fact, there is strong evidence to suggest that parents lie to their children about all sorts of different things. For example, if you eat that watermelon seed, it'll grow a watermelon in your stomach. We don't have any money for toys today, so we have to leave the toy store. Or, I'm sorry, we can't go to the playground because it's closed. So the questions that Candace and I had as we began this project were around the role that the lying about Santa Claus, that both seems to be promoted in the culture, but also causes a lot of anxiety, plays in this larger picture of how parents raise kids and how they promote honesty and lie to their kids overall. We know that these lies work, and we know that they might be harmful. So children's belief is strongly related to parent encouragement and experiences. The more you promote Santa, the more your kids believe in him. We know that even Jewish children and children whose parents are not directly promoting Santa will often believe in Santa because they pick up on belief from the broader culture. And we also know that more broadly, parents lie pretty often. So work by Gail Heyman and Sito has shown that 85% of American parents, 98% of Chinese parents, and 100% of Singaporean parents say that they lie to their children for instrumental value. And we know that these lies can be harmful. Parenting by lying is associated with negative psychosocial outcomes and psychopathology in a variety of studies, including longitudinal ones. So this leads then to the question of how much do parents lie or not lie to their children about Santa compared to these other instrumental topics that we know are quite common to be lied about? Why do parents lie about Santa? And why do those parents who don't lie choose to not lie about Santa? And then how does Santa lying fit in with this larger wish to raise honest and moral children that parents have? So we've conducted 2 studies on this question. The first study was conducted in November of 2021. We pre-registered it on As Predicted and engaged to make sure that these were really parents filling out this survey online. We had screening questions, attention check items, and qualitative items. And that gave us 236 valid responses. The mean child age for this sample was just over 6 years old with a standard eve of 3 years old, but children could be up to 17 for these parents. And we had a number of people who didn't complete, and we were that. So we started just by asking, do you celebrate Santa at home with your children? And we just asked yes or no. Do you celebrate Santa at home with your children? And then we also asked, do you interact with your child as if Santa Claus is real? So both of these are forms of dishonesty or lying about Santa Claus. And you can see that we had high numbers of Santa promoters or Santa celebrators in our sample, and it didn't change very much with age. I'm sorry. Hang on, popped forward. You can also see, though, when we talk about interacting with Santa, interacting with your child as if Santa is real, there does seem to be this dip between 8 and 9 years old, and a small dip between 8 and 9, and then this larger dip between 10 years old, sort of going all the way out until children are 17 and 18 years old. We then asked about activities around Santa, and we gave parents an option of up to 18 different activities that they could engage in with their children around Santa, everything from writing letters and a wish list to singing songs about Santa and Rudolph. And we asked them how often they engaged in these activities, from never to daily. We also then counted up how many activities out of the 18 that parents engaged in. Our average number of experiences was just over once a month at 2.01. But do note that a lot of these Santa experiences are only meant to be ritualized once every season, right? You only give presents from Santa once, you eat cookies and drink milk once. In the United States, you put out hay for the reindeer once over the course of the Christmas season. But on average, parents are giving kids just over 9 different Santa promoting activities. And in fact, there were no significant differences by age here. So even the parents who are having kids that are above the age of disbelief seem to still be promoting Santa pretty strongly, or at similar levels as children under the age of disbelief. We then asked about these instrumental lies using Gail Heyman's Parenting by Lying scale. And we asked about the instrumental lies in 2 ways. First, we asked about the frequency of lies. So how often are you telling children lies? Things like, there's no food available, even though there is. So there's no more candy in the house. Or as someone once sent me a message, there are no more hot dogs in the city of Chicago. I'm sorry, you can't have them for dinner. Then we also asked them about the acceptability of these lies. So how acceptable is it for you to tell your child something to make them feel good about themselves, even though it's not accurate? So for example, your piano playing is beautiful, even when it's not. So then, in order to have the parallel to Santa Claus, we created a Santa Claus version of both the frequency scale for lies and the acceptability scale for lies. So we asked about items like, do you show your child evidence that Santa is real? So look, this special radar or NORAD actually tracks Santa going around the world. How acceptable is it for Stephanie to say to her child, if you don't behave better, you'll be on the naughty list? Or for Mark to say something like, I'm not sure, what do you think? We then finally gave a socialization of lying and honesty scale by Victoria Talwar and colleagues. And these are items in which parents have to say things about whether or not they're directly socializing honesty, how much do they value honesty, as well as things like encouraging and modeling lying and giving consequences for lying, such as punishment. And you can see here that on a 1 to 4 scale, our parents are scoring almost at about 3 for valuing and socializing honesty, just above the midpoint of the scale for encouraging and modeling lying, and scoring quite high, a mean of 3.34 for consequences for lying. So almost at ceiling there for giving consequences for lying. Now the results. So we separated our data in this sample from the people who celebrate Santa at home and the people who don't celebrate Santa at home. So this is about 3/4 of our sample celebrates Santa at home. Remember, regardless of age of child. And you can see that the celebrators lie about Santa a lot more, and they also find the Santa lies more acceptable. They are significantly higher on their frequency of instrumental lying, but not on their acceptability of instrumental lying. But you can see that the effect size for the Santa lies is larger for the celebrators than it is for the instrumental lies. Similarly, when we look at the socialization of honesty, you can see that the parents who are celebrating Santa at home are socializing honesty significantly less than the non-celebrators and encouraging lying significantly more. So taken together, this suggests that Santa Claus lying seems to be part of this broader picture of instrumental lying, as well as lower levels of socializing honesty and higher levels of encouraging lying. So it seems to be part of a piece about honesty and lying for these parents. Then we ask the factors that influence how parents approach Santa with their children. So this is across the range of celebrators and non-celebrators, people who promote him strongly and people who don't. And we asked them a variety of different possibilities for why they talk about Santa with their kids in the way that they do. So some of these possibilities are things like tradition and fun, keeping their children in the mode of childhood and purity and innocence. We also asked about mixed feelings and worry about talking about Santa in this way. We talked about having preference for adults and authority, and then also ideas around giving. So I will say for this scale, and if there's anyone in the audience who is interested in psychonomics, who wants to do some psychometric work on the why do you approach Santa Claus in the way that you do, please feel free to reach out to Candace and myself. We're not experts in psychometrics, but the exploratory factor analyses here, as well as the clustering analyses here, is wild. And so we're not 100% sure what's happening as far as the grouping of the reasons why parents talk about Santa in the way that they do. What I'm going to present to you instead is just some descriptive statistics in order to talk about the top reasons why the celebrators say that they celebrate Santa and the non-celebrators say that they don't celebrate Santa. So for all of these celebrator reasons, they are above the midpoint of the scale, somewhere between somewhat agree and our score of 7 of strongly agree. So number 5 is, I don't want my child to be the one to ruin Santa for other children. Celebrating Santa is part of my culture. Santa can enrich children's childhood through the magic of the holiday. I celebrate Santa because Santa was part of my traditions in my family when I was a child. And finally, no, celebrating Santa is fun. So this fun tradition sort of culture endorsement seems to be the top 5 reasons. But of course, what's interesting too are the non-celebrators' reasons for talking about Santa in the way that they do. However, I will note that the averages for these reasons are lower than the averages for the reasons that the celebrators celebrate. We're down in neither agree nor disagree or agree for the endorsement of these items. So number 5, I want my child to be grateful to me for the gifts they receive, not to Santa. Teaching children the truth about Santa shows them how giving people can be. So these ideas around giving and gifts that happen at Christmas. I worry that lying to children about Santa may have a negative impact on their trust of adults one day. And hold on to that item for Candace's talk because we actually have data there. I worry sometimes about lying to my child about Santa, so I try to avoid outright lies. And I think this is a really interesting area for future research, this sort of difference between lies of omission and lies of commission, right? Outright lies versus just sort of letting the story continue to happen. And then I don't want my child to be the one to ruin Santa for other children is the most endorsed item for the non-celebrators, which is, again, a really interesting area for future research, which is this balance between not celebrating Santa at home, but then making sure that the child is still sort of appropriately talking about Santa for the broader culture, this real indication of Santa as integrated into the culture. So then, and I know Jackie's going to be talking about this too, we do have some data on religiosity. I will note that our sample here, because it was a snowball sample in this first study, is not very religious at all. They go to church, church or other religious ceremonies maybe once a month or less. And there's not very high in daily prayer or intrinsic religiosity. It's more about sort of weekly prayer or meditation, and intrinsic religiosity is how much does religion affect their behavior in daily life, and this is below the midpoint of the scale here. However, regardless of these sort of lower numbers, we have no difference in religiosity by whether or not parents celebrate Santa at home. Religiosity does not predict the number of Santa experiences, and it does not predict the frequency of Santa lying. So Santa seems to be somewhat separate from religiosity in this sample. So our conclusions from study 1 is that parents are engaging in a lot of false Santa promotion, and they find Santa lies more acceptable than other kinds of lies, but it does matter whether or not they celebrate Santa Claus at home with their kids. Age is negatively associated with interacting as if Santa is real, but not Santa promotion or Santa celebration. And parents who celebrate Santa do so for many reasons, why parents who don't celebrate Santa endorse worrying about trust, not wanting to directly lie, and wanting to show the reality of giving for their approach about Santa Claus. So some limitations here. We had a relatively high socioeconomic status and an American sample for this study. And we didn't know anything about whether or not the kids actually believed in Santa. So what are kids actually taking away, or what are parents' impressions of what kids are taking away? So in study 2, we approached this question with a larger sample, a more restricted age range for the kids of our sample. So we restricted it to 2 and 12 years old. And we got better measurement of child belief and of parental endorsement and change. However, I want to pause here for just 1 second and ask Rohan to check the calendar. How much time do I have left before I should open up for questions? Because I'm really interested in questions.
We've got another 15 minutes before we toggle over to me.
Okay, great. So I will just pop on a few of the results for this so I can make sure to open up for questions, but we will have time for chatting overall as well. So we gave the same items here as we gave in study 1, but we added 2 items. Do you, with your child at their current age, interact with them as if Santa Claus is real as the only measure of engaging about Santa Claus and lying about Santa Claus sort of directly asked? We gave still the scale of frequency and acceptability of Santa lies, but this was the most direct question we asked. We then also asked, does your child currently believe that Santa is real? And parents were able to say yes, not sure, or no. We had 509 participants from Prolific after we rejected 100 plus, and 77% of this sample is from the UK, with then distribution across Australia, the United States, and Canada for the rest of the sample. So you can see, again, we have this dip sort of at 8 and 9 years old, with this drop at 10 years old for whether or not you interact with Santa as if he is real. We also have a nicer distribution of ages across the bottom here. You can see our sample has a good distribution from that 2-year-old to 12-year-old. And then you can also see that belief in Santa drops between 7 and 8 years old, which has been the average age for Santa disbelief since Anderson and Prentice were doing their studies in the early 90s. It doesn't seem to change over time very much. You can see also that parents are interacting as if Santa is real less as their children have less belief, and giving fewer experiences as they say their children have less belief. But I'm just going to pop over to the reasons why parents are interacting with their children in the way that they are around Santa Claus. So what this is are correlates for low scores on interacting as if Santa is real. So basically the negative correlations between the reasons why I interact with Santa in the way that I do and I interact with my child around Santa Claus as if he's not real. I don't lie to my child about Santa. And again, you see that we have the same high reasons as we did in study 1, which is I want my child to be grateful to me for the gifts they receive, not to Santa. I worry about lying to my child about Santa, so I try to avoid outright lies. I worry that it has a negative impact on their trust of adults one day. And then here we have, I worry that celebrating Santa might influence my child's views on religion. And that's because this sample is slightly more religious than our American sample. But you can see that when we look at which parts of religiosity are associated with interacting as if Santa is real, it's actually daily prayer that is the significant predictor. So when we predict interacting as if Santa is real by these 3 parts of religiosity, attending church and intrinsic religiosity are not significant predictors, but daily prayer, so that daily sort of engagement with religion is a significant negative predictor of interacting as if Santa is real. So I will just note that when we ask anything else you'd like to tell us, parents have a variety of responses. I enjoy this survey, puts things into perspective. Answering these questions has proven the dilemma. No, I don't have anything else to tell you. Santa's magical. We shouldn't feel guilty about this. I feel incredibly guilty about not telling my children about Santa, but I don't know the best way to talk to them, especially my older son who still believes at 13. And then my favorite, I get what you're doing, but really don't care, as Christmas is magical for kids. So I think this is really super rich data. It's a really super rich area of investigation about Santa Claus. And I think Santa Claus lies are part of a broader picture of lying, not a separate case. People tend to somewhat disagree with whether or not instrumental lies are acceptable, but neither agree nor disagree with Santa lies. Parents who don't celebrate and celebrate Santa Claus the least note trust of adults, not wanting to directly lie to their kids and wanting to show giving, but they also note that they don't want kids to ruin Santa Claus for others, whether or not they celebrate and promote Santa, showing this sort of push and pull between the broader cultural implications of Santa Claus and personal parental choices about Santa. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening. And of course, thank you to Candace, my collaborator on all of this work. Thank you to the John Templeton Foundation and the Honesty Project for funding this work. And thank you to all of you for listening.
I'm sure everybody is clapping at home. Thank you, Thalia, so much. That was super interesting stuff. I've known about your work for a while, and this is the first time I've seen some of those results, which is really exciting stuff. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. So if you do have any questions, please just put them into the chat. And while people are kind of composing their thoughts, Thalia, what was kind of the biggest surprise in that data for you?
Honestly, I mean, I'm always surprised by how many different Santa experiences parents provide for their kids. So an average of 9 Santa experiences for parents. I think I was also pretty surprised by how in the American sample, religiosity wasn't associated with the Santa lies. And also just how many reasons parents are saying they promote Santa Claus. Our celebrators, the people who sort of say that they're really celebrating Santa at home with their kids, have lots and lots and lots of reasons why they're doing it. So I think, as psychologists and people who are doing research here, we always want to look for sort of a simple, straightforward answer. And I think this behavior is way more complex than maybe I gave it credit for when we first started out on this work.
Yeah, cool. So Thalia, we have a question here from Christina. There's a few popping in now.
Great.
Was it intentional to run the study in November? I'm just curious how parent perceptions may be different closer to Christmas than at other times of the year. Also, wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much. So we did purposefully run study 1 in November of 21 and study 2 in December of 2022, just because it's on parents' minds. I think it would be really interesting to ask about, like, parents and fictional characters and Santa Claus in May and June and July. And I know, Rowan, you have some data on this as well. But I do think we purposefully tapped into like when it starts to become an area of concern. I just don't think parents are actually thinking about it all that much at other times of the year. Although sometimes kids sort of figure it out in July. Or I have a friend whose daughter found the elf on the shelf hiding in the back of the closet in early September, and then sent her mom a very angry text message that said, like, you lied, I found the elf. So certainly it can come up at other times of year too.
Great. Question from Sane Lee. Thanks for the super cool talk. I have two questions. One, did children ask or talk about Santa first before their parents did? I wonder how who bought Santa thing might matter to parents' choice to lie or not. And two, I wonder whether you have a cross-cultural study including some countries with weaker Santa trust.
Yeah, this is such a great question. We don't have any data in this study over who brought up Santa Claus or who brought Santa into the home. I've heard some anecdotes from colleagues and friends about like, I wasn't going to do the Santa thing. And then my 4-year-old came home from preschool with like a whole list of questions. We do have some data about parents and kids and their natural conversations that are happening around Santa Claus and questions that kids are bringing up around Santa Claus over the course of the month of December, but those aren't quite ready for prime time yet. So hopefully they'll be coming out in the next little bit. For the cross-cultural study, I would love to do that study because I do think there are so many characters that are differently promoted and differently believed in. So for example, across Latin America, Santa Claus does not come to your house. He may exist as a form and as a figure, but the Reyes Magos, the 3 wise men, come to your house in January to leave you presents in your shoes. And so it's a sort of different structure of how the whole thing works, but there's still this belief component. So I think this sort of anthropological, cultural, psychological perspective on it is really needed.
Great, yeah. This dovetails nicely into the next question by Karen, which has been echoed by some others. Does your study do any correlation with Santa beliefs and the Easter Bunny?
Yeah, so in study 1, we did ask about how much parents promote a variety of fictional characters, including the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy, and then also aliens and ghosts and witches, and then also things like germs and dinosaurs, right? Because there's wonderful work from Jackie, from Rowan, from many others, Paul Harris, talking about all of these different types of characters and all of these different kinds of entities where parental testimony really is how children come to understand and believe. We did not ask the kids directly about Easter Bunny because we didn't ask the kids directly in this study, but we did find that parents are promoting Santa more than Tooth Fairy and Easter Bunny, but the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny are still being promoted more than aliens and ghosts and witches. And that's data also that echoes this child's pantheon of belief work that Rowan and I published couple years ago now with a few other colleagues, showing this sort of clear cultural character is higher than other kinds of fictional characters or other kinds of entities that parents may promote through testimony.
Thanks, Thalia. We got a couple more here and a couple of minutes, 2 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes. Rennie, thank you for the talk. Why do you think some parents interpreted the questions in this survey as somewhat judgmental? And do you think that speaks to something broader about the dilemma that parents feel inclined to keep the Santa charade, but they do feel guilty? They do feel guilt they don't admit to feeling.
Yeah, I think so one of the things that was particularly interesting actually was the age changed for how much parents interact as if Santa was real, but it didn't change how much parents promoted Santa or how much parents celebrated Santa. And I think that speaks to an important distinction that this work and sort of work around Santa generally needs to consider carefully going forward, which is the difference between a direct lie about Santa in which you are promoting supernatural or magical truths, right? That he flies around the world, or that he comes down your chimney, or that the presents are from him, versus the idea of sort of fun celebration, or we're all in on the fiction of it and we're just having a party or having a good time, right? So I think about the parallels to things like superheroes and Disney princesses, where parents are not necessarily promoting, at least I haven't seen evidence that parents are promoting Elsa as a real person who really exists in a real place named Arendelle, or Spider-Man is a real person who really exists and Gotham is a real place, or I'm sorry, Gotham is Batman. Wow. Or New York City or Nueva York, or depending on where you are in the Spider-Man multiverse. So I think this is really the question that requires more exploration. Is this push and pull between behaving as if he's real and acting as if he's real in a way in which you want your children to honestly believe in the truth about Santa, versus having the sort of party celebration, isn't this fun, we're all playing together, we're all pretending together, that might be sort of closer to what parents are doing when they take their children to a theme park to interact with these superheroes. So there's not a lot of evidence here to see how parents figure this out for themselves and with their kids. We actually don't have, as far as I know, much evidence about whether or not who children think those people at Disneyland are when you introduce them to the people at Disney. And so I think it's a really fruitful area for future investigation.
Great, thank you, Thalia. We might wrap there, but there are some outstanding questions. So Christina, Rebecca, Malia, just a reminder for everyone, if you three could just keep a note of your questions. We will have a full half hour after Jackie, the final speaker, finishes her talk, where we will reopen the space for questions and kind of open the forum up for others to weigh in on each other's positions.
And I'll also note that for some of these questions, just looking at them, hopefully the talks by Jackie and Candace and Rianne and Rohan will actually start to answer some of these questions too, because we're all approaching this from a slightly different perspective.
Yeah. Great. Well, the schedule says it's on me. Thalia, if I can ask you to keep an eye on the admissions and the questions
Will
for
do.
me, please.
Yeah.
Okay, let's share my screen. Actually, I hadn't seen Thalia's data before, and I think I actually have there's some overlap in these topics and questions and methodologies, which I guess shouldn't be too surprising, because it's Santa. But yeah, hopefully I can kind of add a little bit to the story here. So this is work that I've been doing with my colleagues Maddie Wilkes and Catherine Francis. Catherine's in the audience here today, I believe. And Maddie and I had started this 4 years ago in 2019. And we were motivated by a very simple question. Do children behave better around Christmas? The idea is that Santa's making a list. He's checking who's naughty and nice. Does it actually matter? And so we wanted to attend to this from a longitudinal point of view. So normally when I'm discussing Santa to people, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here a little bit, but the reason Santa is interesting to me, the reason I think it's not just a toy problem, but something far more significant, is that Santa's an omniscient, morally concerned supernatural agent who acts upon the world. Santa is functionally a god. And in some ways, he's more of a god than some other gods because the presents show up on Christmas morning. Santa has a devoted set of believers who recognize the symbols and doctrine of Christmas and the agent himself, Santa. It just so happens they tend to be 7 or 8 years or younger. Nonetheless, having a devoted set of believers offers a really interesting opportunity to examine big and important and often theoretical questions about the development of religious-like beliefs. It's a nice way of addressing questions of belief and development that allow us to sidestep practical and ethical issues of working with children in the domain of religion, which can be challenging and which parents tend to have strong opinions about. Whereas since parents know Santa's a lie, they're a bit more willing for us to kind of probe those ideas. So we have multiple years of data here. I'm only going to go into the final one, but the history of the project probably should be illustrated a little. So in 2019, we recruited 85 parents with children aged between 5 and 8 years. We administered the first part of the survey on December 6th and the second on Boxing Day. And we were asking parents about the behavior of their children in the preceding 7 days. Not just their behavior, but the parents' behavior, opinions, beliefs, other things as well. I'm not going to present any results there, but we did learn a lot. We polished our measures, we refined them, we improved them. And in 2021, we reran the study. We skipped December 2020 because there was a bit of a sickness going around, and that year was kind of an unusual time to be a citizen of Earth, among other things. So in 2021, we recruited about 100 parents. We expanded the age range in which they had their children. We started the first wave of the study a little bit earlier on November 26. And it had very much the same methodology. It was just polished a bit more. We had measures from the preceding 7 days at both time points, and the surveys were identical this time at both time points. So we have fully within data. So last year, we did the big one, the one that we were very confident would reveal to us if there's an effect, allow us to genuinely test our hypotheses. So we recruited 274 parents. There was that's the working number. We had a few more that we had to exclude for various reasons. Children were 5 to 9. We pushed it back even further to November 21, and we asked them about the preceding 7 days. Much like Thalia and her 5-point scale for belief, we had these. We asked our 274 parents what they think about their child's endorsement of Santa as a real agent. Left is T1, right is T2, and what you can see is that 3/4 of children are convinced Santa is real. Then we drop down to about 1 in 5 children have some doubts about Santa's existence. A child, less than 3 or 4% think that have agnostic views on Santa. Only 3 or 2% have considerable doubts, and 1 in 100, 2 in 100 children in our sample don't believe in Santa, or at least according to their parents. Now you can see here the line graph showing change. There is a little bit of change here. Statistically, it doesn't make a difference. We don't see a push up or down. Remember, 3/4 of the kids believe and remains believing. And the way we're interpreting this is more about a parent updating their understanding of what their child believes, rather than like a loss of belief. In most cases. So when we asked parents about how important it was that their child believed, we actually got a relatively flat distribution. Certainly for some parents, it is very important, but it seems to be, more uniform and kind of more idiosyncratic according to families. But when we asked them about the importance of celebrating Christmas, about engaging with the pageantry and everything that is Christmas, the vast majority of parents rated that as considerably important, somewhat orthogonal to the belief values. We were very interested in kind of trying to capture as much metrics of like what is happening in households at the time. I have skipped my hypotheses. I must have skipped past that slide. I'll return to those in a second. Actually, I'll do that now. There they are. My mouse is obviously a bit twitchy. So, like I said, Santa's essentially a god. We had 4 really basic hypotheses. All of these are theoretically motivated, but I don't have the time to really dive into them. But the first one is that a child's belief in Santa will positively predict nice behavior, right? Their behavior will improve as Santa approaches, if they believe in it. The saliency of all the rituals of Christmas should predict positive behavioral change. I guess Thalia kind of had a little bit of data that touched on that, which was neat. But there's a lot of good theory and evidence in adults that show being reminded of the symbols of your belief influences your behavior consistent with those beliefs. There's some nuances in there, but like the broad strokes, the more you're reminded of the thing, the more you behave consistent with it. We have these things called creds, credibility enhancing displays, which is a fancy way of saying Christmas relevant behavior. Wearing, like giving a little bit more to charity, spending more time with family, doing these kinds of things. I'll show you the scale later. And that a child's age will predict positive behavioral change simply because older children have better executive function or more developed executive function. Okay, with that in mind, let's go back. So what was happening in these houses? So remember, this one is November 21, so the week preceding November 21, so a full 6 weeks before Christmas, 5 or 6 weeks. And we were asking parents how often they were talking about Christmas, Santa, gifts, and religion. And you can see here that in all cases, the conversations become more focused on each of these topics. These are significant differences. Even the religion one, surprisingly, this sample of UK parents was quite irreligious. We do have some more detailed measures of religiosity, but this was not a religious sample by any measure. But as you can see, parents are talking about this stuff more with their children. We asked parents about the topics their children brought up, and we see very much the same pattern. But 6 weeks out, I mean, I'm not a parent, so I'm sure there are parents in the audience here. If your 6-year-old is bringing up Christmas and Santa in the middle of November, multiple times a day, I feel for you because that's setting the bar high. But what you can see here is that, like, about Christmas, in the week before Christmas, 174 of our 274 kids were just talking about Christmas multiple times every day, at least once a day and multiple times a day. 200 of these kids were just talking about Santa at least once a day. Not too surprising, really. This is just a nice BS check that, you know, the phenomena, you know, Christmas is relevant. Similar to Thalia's work, Thalia and Candace's work, we were also interested if parents used Santa as a behavioral motivator, as a carrot or a stick. So something like you know, an example of a negative use of this might be like, stop hitting your sister, or Santa will only bring you coal. So a kind of threat, whereas a positive use of Santa would be something like, be nice and Santa will be able to bring you the things you want for Christmas. We didn't prescribe that too much. We allowed parents to define that themselves. But as you can see here, parents seem fairly willing to use Santa as a behavioral tool even in the middle of November. So what else might influence a child's behavior in that period of time? Well, we asked parents on a 5-point scale how much free time or family time, stress, and excitement they had. So for the child, how much free time did they have compared to the average week? We start slightly above the midpoint statistically, and children have more free time, much more free time as Christmas approaches. No big surprise. Same with family time, basically on the midpoint, a lot more family time in the week preceding Christmas. Here's where some stuff gets interesting. Parents start stressed well above the midpoint and get more stressed over the subsequent 6 weeks. But this is mirrored by the fact that their excitement also increases. Even in the middle of November, parents are excited about Christmas, and that excitement increases. We asked parents on a 4-point scale, how much was the time of year a source of negative emotion? Parents started below the midpoint and then blew right past it. Christmas is an increasing source of negative emotion. We asked them how much was the time of year a source of positive emotion. They started well above the midpoint and declined. Christmas is a time of high and increasing stress, middling to increasing negative emotions, and declining positive emotions. Now, that's really interesting if you know a little bit about imagistic rituals and these kinds of things. I'm happy to answer questions about it. I can dive into that a little bit more, but I think that's the beauty of this kind of empirical interrogation, because I don't think most parents would intuit these results. But I triple checked that I didn't get these numbers backwards, and I've run it 3 years. I've run it 3 times over 4 years. This is what's happening. Great. So when it comes to Christmas creds, behaviors that are relevant to Christmas, we took an established scale that's typically used for religion and simply applied it to Christmas. So how often do you attend Christmas-themed services or events? Carols by candlelight, going to the mall to see the mall Santa. To what extent do you embody the values of Christmas? I can't speak for everyone, but, I try to give a little bit more to rough sleepers and charities at that time because it's Christmas time. Also in the UK, it's really cold and super unpleasant. You can go through this scale, but it is a scale that we've adapted from an existing measure of religiosity. And what you can see at both time points is it has really nice psychometric properties. It is a trait-like measure. I'm fairly confident that if I gave this to parents in June, it would still look very much like this. Although we do see a very slight increase over those 6 weeks, which again is not too surprising, but it is the case that we have a normal distribution of parents committing to Christmas-relevant behaviors. So the real kicker is measuring how children behave. If you've ever try to look at how children behave, it's a really messy thing because kids are kind of chaotic. When they're high arousal, they might be doing good. They might also be doing bad. So we had these 5 categories: sharing, helping, obedience, harming, comforting, and selfishness. And we did think that this would factor out into five profiles, 5 factors. But actually what we found was 3 factors which aligned with unprompted behavior, prompted behavior, so mum or dad tells you to do something and then you share with your little sister, and deviant behavior, throwing tantrums, protesting rules and things. A little bit unexpected, but if you look at the scale we have here, 2020 hindsight and all that, but that is what happened. We found 3 useful factors. Surprisingly, those 18 items had a remarkable reliability. We didn't expect that, but that is what we found and have found over multiple instances of this research. What you're seeing here is a delta, so a step up in behavior or a step down in behavior. The middle high density area is 0, so that's like no change. My child protests rules just as often in November as they did in December. But in the top half, that's steps up of improving behavior, or steps down in declining negative behavior. So what did we find? Well, it was a nonlinear scale. So a jump from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3, that didn't necessarily represent one more behavior. So we were conservative here and collapsed our nonlinear scale so that any jump from 1 to 2 or 2 to 5, for example, was simply recorded as +1, just an improvement. Likewise, if there was a jump from 2 to 1 or from 4 to 2 or something, that was simply a -1, okay? The behavior declined. Now, if you just run a really simple t-test, what you actually find is between the middle of November and the week preceding Christmas, prompted prosocial behavior improves. Unprompted prosocial behavior also improves. Deviant behavior declines. So we have here the scale for unprompted behavior. Here you can see we have the prompted behavior, a very narrow distribution there, and a decline in the naughty behaviors, the deviant behaviors. Obviously not huge effects, but this is why we had to run a big sample, because honestly, I didn't think any of this would happen. So I'm frankly surprised to find any measure matching this. Now, I'm a scholar of ritual primarily, so kind of similar to what Thalia did, we were looking at, were people erecting trees inside the house? Were they wearing ugly sweaters, ugly Christmas sweaters? Were they eating different foods? Were they listening to different kinds of music? You can see here that across the board, it improves, it increases. It's non-zero in the middle of November, and I guess you can probably all figure out why, because we can't avoid it. Like the shops are already playing Christmas carols and so on. So I think that's what we're capturing here is the cultural background that is Christmas. So our hypotheses. I've run two sets of regressions. Well, 2 sets of regressions with the same predictors. When we looked at the measures primarily associated with our hypotheses, we found that a measure of overall behavior, so that's unprompted behavior, prompted behavior, and reverse-coded deviant behavior, all mashed together. Age did not predict it. Belief in Santa did not predict it. Ritual salience, the frequency of like a tree in the house and carols playing, positively improved children's behavior from time 1 to time 2. And strangely, Christmas creds, so parents modeling Christmas relevant behaviors like charity and generosity and things, declined. Prosocial behavior declined. Some kind of backfire effect. I can speculate on that in the questions. And when we looked at the subscales, prompted, unprompted, and deviant, we find the effect is primarily driven by unprompted behavior. So rituals don't seem to have an effect on like prompted behavior or deviant behavior, but we see unprompted behavior. Children seem to be reminded by the background radiation of Christmas. Then when we ran the regression with all of our variables in it, like free time, parental stress, the degree to which belief, parents think it's important to believe, or the importance of Christmas, we find unprompted behavior is improved by ritual saliency, and Christmas relevant parental behaviors has a negative effect on unprompted behavior. Not unprompted or deviant behaviors, so the effect is primarily driven in the unprompted domain, when parents can kind of still see but are not governing directly their children's behavior. So regarding hypotheses, do children behave better? Are they nicer and less naughty? Well, we found no support for the idea that belief would predict child's positive behavior. Possibly because we didn't have enough variance. 75% of the kids were at ceiling. Saliency of Xmas rituals will predict positive behavioral change. Well, we found some support for that in the domain of unprompted behavior, and in a less rich regression, some overall support for it as well. Do Christmas creds predict positive behavioral change? Well, we found a significant but negative relationship. This might be some kind of backfire effect. This might be the fact that the variance is being soaked up elsewhere. It's unclear what that is exactly. And we did not find support for a child's age predicting positive behavioral change, which, to be honest, was a little surprising. Final slide here, final insights. The data collected here, I think, is really rich and has a lot of value as a quantitative description. And we have a ton more data. This is just like the bare bones of what we collected. Empirically, and I think this is interesting and important, children don't lose their belief for Santa at Christmas or due to Christmas. I don't think that's been documented anywhere else. I mean, Thalia had some stuff there in her talk, but like when children lose belief, this suggests to me that it's outside of Christmas time. And there's a few reasons why that might be. Maintaining belief in this sample of UK parents is not particularly important, but Christmas itself is important. Parents use Santa as a behavioral tool. Now, we have no evidence that that works over the span of 6 weeks. It might work on the scale of minutes and hours, maybe even days, but we have no evidence that it's working in like a long-term and enduring fashion. So I make no judgment about whether you should or shouldn't use Santa as a threat with your kids. I would just say that it doesn't have a long-term impact, or at least we have no evidence for that. And finally, it's interesting that belief doesn't predict behavior. Assuming that is not just a statistical artifact, that's actually quite interesting because we have evidence that belief influences behavior in adults. But if we don't have evidence of belief influencing behavior in children, that tells us maybe there's something really developmentally interesting going on about belief in these kinds of agencies and the doctrines thereof. So thank you all for listening. That was my findings, which hopefully will be submitted for review in the next couple months.
Wonderful. And I can see lots of people applauding again in their emojis and at home. Great. So we have about 7-8 minutes for questions here. And so please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Do any of our other panelists have a question for Rohan to start with? Feel free to unmute other fellow panelists.
And Catherine is here, co-author, expert in moral psychology, who really helped carry some of this project. She might be able to field some of the questions as well.
Great. Candace, go ahead.
Thank you for sharing that. It was really interesting. I'm curious about the backfire effect and how much of that has to do with a parent's skewed perspective of behavior or skewed expectations of what they should be seeing from their kids, or what you're thinking is going on.
I think the simplest speculation here is that parents who are embodying these values are probably more closely regulating their children's behavior. And so we might see a decline in unprompted behaviors, but that's going to be matched in prompted behaviors. Now, we didn't statistically detect that, but talking to parents in various contexts about these results, it strikes me that parents are just getting a little bit more involved. And what we're seeing a decline in unprompted behaviors because there's less opportunity for unprompted behaviors. But that is a speculative, that's what I think is plausible, but it is speculative, and I more research is needed.
We have a question in the chat from Brandy. You mentioned that the variants might be soaked up elsewhere, meaning how do Christmas rituals and Christmas creds relate? Are they highly correlated?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I haven't run that correlation. I think it must be the case. If you're putting on the jumpers and you're giving to charity more and going to the mall and carols by candlelight and stuff, you're probably also putting the tree up before December 1st. That is a question I could answer empirically, but can't immediately. But yeah, I'll look into that because that seems like a very sensible claim.
Other questions? Pop them in the chat. I was wondering about religiosity, and particularly the children's own understanding of their religiosity. Santa, I think one of the primary messages around Santa is naughty and nice list and earning presents, and you better watch out, you better not cry. But there are lots of different ways to be religious, right? Some religions are more sort of circumspect about the ways in which your behavior is related to various outcomes, and other religions are very direct about sort of here are the things you are supposed to do and not do, and the strictness with which you need to abide by them. So I'm wondering sort of your thoughts on the strictness of religiosity versus the very forward appearance of how Santa affects children's outcomes.
Yeah. I might also throw this one open to Catherine in a minute as well. I am not a Brit. I was not raised in the UK. We did also have measures of religiosity, validated measures of religiosity, and this was a very irreligious sample, just because I guess that's who we got on Prolific. What I think is happening is the UK, it's not like America in how ubiquitous religion is. And it's very different from Australia, where religion is a very minor feature in public life. But religion here is, and saying this as a migrant, there's a lot more religious permeation everywhere. And Catherine might be able to speak to this as well. Like Christianity type religion is taught in schools and stuff. So it's very possible that children are just simply reflecting commentary that's happening on the TV or in schools. I'm not entirely sure what's happening there. We did also ask parents to ask their children for us, what do you think being nice means? Or like, how do you get on Santa's nice list? And what is naughty and stuff? And they had the cutest little responses, like, I do what mommy and daddy say and I eat all my vegetables, or I make sure I feed the cat on time and I do my homework. It was not a sophisticated level of reasoning on what nice and what naughty is. And I wouldn't expect, given that like the religious cognitions associated with it would be much more sophisticated. But maybe in an American sample where a more religious background radiation, that might be more illuminating. Catherine, did you maybe want to offer some thoughts on religiosity and moral behavior there?
Yeah, I mean, maybe not moral behavior and religiosity. I think that's another. Sure. That would take hours. But just on the UK side of things, I think there's, we can look at consensus data to get a feel for kind of self-reported religiosity. But I think in the latest consensus for England and Wales, it was sort of, I think it was about 37% of UK residents reported not having a religion or not practicing a religious practice of any kind, which is quite high. So I think extending this to other environments where those practices might be more common would probably be really valuable and really useful. And then obviously there are a number of individuals who say that they are Christian, for example, because they might have gone to a primary school that was kind of Church of England. So they would have learnt all those kind of practices when they were children. That was certainly the case for me. But then obviously as they've got older, they don't follow a religious practice of any kind. So yeah, it's really interesting. And I think the UK is a very interesting place to conduct this.
Yeah. Yeah. You're muted, Thalia. Oh.
So just one last question, although there are several still in the chat, so make sure you check those out. And again, we'll get to them a little bit later. So one last question from Julia: does stress correlate with Christmas creds? Is stress over attending events rubbing off on kids?
Yeah, I like the intuition there. I had a similar intuition. In the full write-up of the paper, we do have a big correlation matrix of, these kind of, life factors, these contextual life factors. And I was genuinely surprised how little correlation there was between, stress and excitement. Like, I mean, there were the positive and negative relations you'd expect, but they were very weak, rarely exceeding 0.15. The stronger, and the data seemed reliable because we had a very strong autocorrelation. So parents who were stressed, it was stress at time 1 strongly, like 0.8 or something, predicted stress at time 2. Same with free time, the people who had free time at 2. So we got this within person variance, this autocorrelation. But no, the intuition I think is sensible. I certainly shared it. But no, there's no hints in the data we collected about how stress influences these things. And I think I'd be a bit reluctant to speculate on that further because I'm not a parent. I've seen parents, I've seen children, and I think that's not something I could weigh in on with any authority, but the numbers don't suggest any kind of interesting factor structure there or clustering, even though we did look for it. So yeah, that was good question.
Great. Okay, well, I'm very proud of all of us for staying on time. And next up, Rianne will be presenting on her work. You better watch out. You better not cry. And then after Rianne, we will take a short break so that everybody can get themselves another cup of coffee or, take a stash from the Christmas cookies. And so Rianne, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll try to share my screen. I hope this works for you.
Looks like it's
Can
working.
everybody...
Yeah, we can see your slides. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, well, I'm very happy to be presenting here on this first SantaCon 2023. My name is Rianne Kok. I work as an associate professor at Youth and Family Studies in Erasmus University Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And I will be talking about lying about Santa from a parenting perspective. A small disclaimer is that I won't be speaking about Santa necessarily, but about his far cousin Sinterklaas. He's the Dutch version of Santa. In short, he comes to the Netherlands, is the story from Spain, every year. He arrived this year on the 18th of November, and he stays in our country for about 2 to 3 weeks until the 5th of December, and that's his birthday. And in those weeks, he brings presents for the children in the Netherlands. It's quite big in the Netherlands. We have a daily news bulletin about Sinterklaas, which is on national television, which all the children watch, also in schools. He visits just about every daycare and school in the Netherlands. So many children in the Netherlands believe in Sinterklaas, and even parents that are trying to avoid the myth are confronted with children coming home believing, even though they didn't instill the magic themselves. And I will be presenting data from a broader study today, the Familize project, which is about lying in families and how parental lying can potentially influence children's moral development. So Santa is not the main subject of our study, but of course it's a subject that you cannot ignore when you're studying parental lying to their own children. And when I'm talking about we today, I mean me and my lovely team, which are on the slide as well. I have 2 PhD students, Emma Rosa and Ines Lucier, and a postdoc researcher, Lisanne Schreur, working on this project with me. And within the Familize project, one of our goals is to shed light on the diversity and the variation in the types of lies that parents tell their children. For the purpose of this, we also conducted a qualitative interview study with parents, and I will be presenting data from that study today. So what we wanted to do in our interview study is get a broad idea of the types of lies that are told by parents, with the goal to create a taxonomy of parental lying, and that makes distinctions between types of lies based on the intention and the means used. And in order to better understand why parents lie, but also how it could affect their children. So what we did, we interviewed 40 parents, about an hour-long interviews, and these parents all had at least one child between the ages of 5 and 12 years. And we talked about lying practices, but also the attitudes about lying to your own children and what triggers lying to children. And we asked very broad questions. For example, what lies do parents tell their children? What lies do you tell your own children? And when and why do you lie to your children? And the reason why we chose to talk about parents in general, as well as about parents' own experiences of lying, is because before we started this study, we weren't that sure whether parents would be keen to talk to us, to disclose their own lying. So we offered them the option to be talking about other parents instead of about their own practices. But I have to say, we couldn't have been more wrong, because in the interviews that we conducted, we were told 823 unique examples of lies that parents tell children, and 522 of these examples were examples of lies that parents told their own children. So either they said, I have told this lie to my child, or if I were to be in a specific situation, I would tell this particular lie to my child. And what I've been doing in the last couple of months is analyzing all these different examples and looking at how we can cluster them, these different examples, into meaningful categories based on the intentions and the means. And this resulted in a taxonomy of parental lying. I don't have the time to talk about all the different subtypes and categories that we found, because not all categories are relevant for the topic of Santa, because we basically just don't have the time. But based on the intended goal of the parent, we found 8 main categories, which we also sometimes divided into several subcategories. I highlighted the ones that are relevant for Sinterklaas, so where the topic of Sinterklaas was also mentioned. Of course, a main bulk of the lies about Santa were mainly meant to instill the belief in Santa as a fantasy figure, or to maintain the belief in Santa. And parents describe these lies as just being to create a fun experience, so without any extra reasons, just to create a fun experience for their children. And that's why they lied about the existence or the realness of Santa. Other types of lies about Santa were in the category of behavior modification, specifically lying about potential negative outcomes of a child's behavior, and also lying about potential positive outcomes of child's behavior. And a third one was about the lies that were meant to avoid discussion or conflict between parent and child. Before I go into the examples of the different types, I want to start with describing the different perspectives of Dutch parents on the Santa lies. What parents, they often mention Santa as one of the examples of lying, even though we didn't interview them in November, December. But at the same time, parents varied in whether they would call instilling belief in Santa an actual lie. So one parent said, I think lying about Sinterklaas, yes, I believe those are real lies. Whereas another parent says, well, Sinterklaas doesn't exist, but I don't think that's really lying. So there's difference in how parents view the Santa lie. There's also variation in how okay parents felt with lying about Santa to their children. Some parents were okay with it. So one parent said, in case of Sinterklaas, yes, I feel completely content with that, with lying about it. And I think they will understand later why I lied about that. Whereas other parents struggled more, felt ambivalent or even guilty about it. I have trouble with Sinterklaas. I keep out of it. I do sing along, but I don't talk about him. So some parents felt that much guilt that they even didn't want to be part of the whole Santa myth and instilling it in their child. And we saw variation also in how active or passive parents were in instilling the belief. That sort of relates to something that Thalia said about blatant lies versus omissions. So some parents described blatant lies about the existence of Santa Claus, whereas other parents said that they merely sort of omitted the truth or refrained from correcting the belief of the child. Like this parent saying specifically, Sinterklaas, by the way, I actually don't lie about that. I let it happen. So that's more of a passive way of going along with the story. Going on to the parenting aspect, one of the parents very nicely explained how Santa can actually be a tool for parenting. So this parent said, Sinterklaas is a classic example of lying. It's a nice folktale and you can use it to direct your child in the right direction. So for some parents, they explicitly mentioned, it's not just a story, it's not just a myth, but it's useful in a way that I can direct my child, I can discipline my child. It has a sort of a second goal next to the fun part. And the interview showed that there were roughly 2 ways in which Santa was used to modify behavior in children. So we have the examples of sort of the false promises that are made. One common example was, we will ask Sinterklaas. The parents describe, I'm implying that they will get a certain toy that they would want by saying, oh, we can ask Sinterklaas, which basically means if you put it on the list, you'll probably get it. But parents also describe, I don't have the intention to actually buy it. So for me, this is a way of getting out of a situation that I want to get out of, either to make my child comply, so to change their behavior, but it could also be to avoid an endless discussion about why you are not allowed to have this particular toy. The second broad category were the false threats about not getting something from Santa if you don't do this or if you do something else. So you won't get anything from Sinterklaas, but also for the Dutch myth, I said before, Sinterklaas comes from Spain, but there's also in the myth a story that he takes back children that have been naughty on the boat to Spain. So some parents say you will be taken away on the boat to Spain if you don't do this or if you do that. And these lies, these false threats and these false promises actually cluster with other types of lies that are told in the rest of the year. So from January to October, parents have equivalents of these kinds of lies that they use. So for the first example, I will put it on your birthday list is the equivalent of we will ask Sinterklaas, where parents also say, I mentioned that we will put it on the birthday list, but of course I'm not going to buy it because I just don't want to buy that particular toy. So different topic, but same kind of example. And the same holds for the false threats. Parents choose another authority figure. Many times in the Netherlands, parents threaten with calling, for example, the teacher from 2nd grade. If you don't brush your teeth, I will call Miss Daphne and tell her. And for some children, that's a trigger to start brushing their teeth. But also the police, of course, is an authority figure that sometimes is called upon to make the child behave in a certain way. What I wanted to do in the project as well is try to put lying in a broader perspective by looking at why parents resort to these lies and how that fits into current trends also in parenting research. And when we talked to the parents about their triggers and the reasons why they resorted to these particular kinds of lies, so the behavior modification lies and the avoiding discussion lies, then many parents mentioned that they did that because they feel overwhelmed and stressed by the burden of taking care of kids, the pressure of having a young family, combining it with work and all sorts of other tasks. And it's linked to also a surge of interest in parental burnout. So many parents report feeling stressed and being overwhelmed, but parental burnout is a state where there's extreme levels of fatigue, but also not feeling yourself anymore. And parental burnout is most prevalent, or it's linked to individualistic culture. So the Netherlands is a very individualistic culture, but for example, there's also high rates in the US and Canada. And there's a strong emphasis on taking care of yourself and relying on yourself. So some parents don't feel the ability or the option to go to others for help. And we had many conversations in the interviews about how stress and feeling overwhelmed is for parents a trigger, because lying can be an easy way out of a situation. And one mother described this very well, I think. She said, when you just don't want to be a parent, when you just don't have the energy and you think, I just want to stop being a mother for now, but it's 12 in the afternoon. And she described, that's the moment when I start lying. That's when the lies pile up, because for me, that's the only way to get through that afternoon. And sadly enough, for many parents, this also, they do this, but at the end, they feel guilty about what they've done. So it also increases the levels of stress. So some parents feel like they're sort of in a cycle, increasing their own stress levels. To round things up, I want to shortly say something about the future directions for studies on parental lying, about Santa, but also lying in general. What I've found since I've been studying this subject is, I think the general public just wants one question to be answered. Is it bad to lie to our children about Santa or in general? The last month, I've been spending most of my time talking to media outlets in the Netherlands about, is it bad that we're lying about Sinterklaas or lying in general? And I think as researchers, we don't have a clear answer to this yet. We need more research. And what kind of research? I think what we should do is we should focus in our research on how parents lie about Santa or in general, and not just the question whether they lie. Because I think it makes a huge difference, or it can make a huge difference in what kinds of lies are told, how often, how extensive. If we're talking about Santa also, do you match your story to the developmental stage of the child, whether they're already sort of finding out about the truth or not? I think those factors are very important. And I know some of the speakers today are already pioneering in this kind of research to find answers to these particular questions. I think it's crucial to distinguish between different types of lies, omission versus commission, blatant lies, but also the difference between a false threat versus just merely instilling belief for fun purposes. I think it's important to study how Santa lies fit into the pattern of parental lying in general, but also how parental lying fits into parenting strategies. And my last point is, I think it's important that we study parental lying from maybe a more neutral perspective. Sometimes when I read studies, I feel like there's already sort of a hypothesis there that lying is bad and something we should avoid. But I think we should also keep the option open that sometimes, or in some situation, not telling the full truth or lying about something might also be a viable option, or even a better option. So I think it's important that we also include, for example, positive outcome measures to really get a balanced view of what lying is and how it affects children, but also the parents themselves. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. If you want to follow our team and research, you can follow us via the channels on the slide. And I'm very happy to answer any questions if there are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rianne. That's really interesting stuff. And certainly as a non-parent myself, it's interesting to see all of this. You know, I guess my data, your data on burnout can also like complement my data on more stress and declining positive emotions and increasing negative emotions. So that's, yeah, there's some cool stuff there. So there are a few questions piling up. The first one from Karen is interesting. This is the Foundation for Alternative Facts. Hadn't thought about this before. Here's the question. Rianne, what is truth?
What is truth? Good question. What is truth? I think I've been asked before, you know, what is the opposite of lying, and is that truth? What I try to do also in my interview study, we merely talk about what do parents consider to be a lie and what is their truth. And that is sort of the boundary between when does it become lying and when does it become the truth? But interestingly, that's also something that was many times a topic in the interviews. Parents talking about, what should we do with religion? The non-religious parents, or talking about the existence of climate change or not. Is that truth or non-truth? So many times that question also was raised by parents, and that's a difficult one to answer. But what we do with our study is just taking the definition of lying and deception in a sense that you're deliberately trying to deceive someone in believing something which you consider to be truth. That's our definition for the research.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, right? People have been arguing about this for a million years, thousands of years rather. Rianne, a gentle request to stop screen sharing so people can see your face and your emotions. From Joe, is there a difference between lying and restricting the truth?
In our research, we look at lying very broadly. So also omitting the truth, half-truths, distortions, making things smaller than they actually are. So you could also say it's more sort of a broader deception that we're looking at. But it depends. In the literature, it's sort of used, I think, sort of intertwined. So some people really look at sort of the blatant lies only, where you're saying something which is untrue, whereas in the conversations with their parents, many times it's about keeping information, making things smaller than they actually are. So distortions and half-truths and omissions are many examples that we find. Yeah.
Sure. We have two questions here, which I'll ask together because they seem related. Christina and then Misha ask, the discussion about parent burnout makes me wonder if there's a correlation with parent lying, not just about Santa, and parent mental health. Have you seen anything in this area? And the second question is, when you say parental burnout, do you mean postpartum depression?
Maybe let's start with the second one. No, I don't mean a postpartum depression necessarily, but I think the same. I mean, parental burnout is, of course, it's related to stress and feeling overwhelmed. And if you have a postpartum depression, you're also stressed and overwhelmed. So I think the same sort of mechanism plays a role, but it's not restricted to postpartum period. So parental burnout can be, at any time period. And for the first question about related to parental mental health, yes, I think in two ways. So first, of course, other types of mental health problems can make parents overburdened, which can lead them to choosing the easy way out, which is how parents in my conversations refer to lying. It's an easy way out of a situation. At the same time, we also hear parents lying about their own mental health to protect their children from that information. So that's a different type of lie, where they're deliberately keeping information about their own mental health because they want to paint the sort of perfect picture of mom being fine or dad being fine. I don't want you to worry about it. So for some parents, it's the protection aspect of it, but I've also talked to parents who are very much aware that they want to be the role model for their children. So they're trying to hide sort of all types of flaws, including I'm not always the happy, bubbly person that I'm pretending to be, but I want to be that person for my child. So I think mental health can play a role in different ways in sort of triggering lying and different types of lies.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to ask a question. If anyone else wants to pose anything to Rianne, please put it in the chat presently. I guess it's not a very creative question, Rianne, but I know that I think all of us in this domain have been put this question to us by reporters and journalists. Should we lie to the kids about, like, what should we do? And I guess maybe let's make this a little bit more pointed. What about the point at which the child loses belief? You know,
Mhm.
lying after that point seems qualitatively different than lying prior to that point. So I don't know, maybe you could reflect on the obligations or prescriptions you might impose, or suggestions you
Yeah,
might make about this stuff.
yeah. I'm always very hesitant to say stop lying or it's bad, because I don't think we have the evidence for that. So I usually say lie consciously. So think about what you want to lie about, and when not. Interestingly, many parents that I talked about said lying is okay as long as they don't find out. So you can lie up to a certain age, and then you have to find a new strategy. And they said, if I ask, what age, they're like, yeah, around 10, then they're not that gullible anymore. So you have to change tactics. And until the time, if they don't find out, it doesn't matter. For some parents, that's their criterion. The question, does it affect their sort of trust in the parent? We're actually working on a study where we're going to ask the children with different examples of lies. It's not about Santa. We're avoiding Santa in that case, but different types of lies, prosocial, or sort of other-oriented, so child-oriented versus self-oriented, but also prudential lies, which are sort of in the best interest of the child for health and safety purposes, where we're basically going to ask children, what do you think of that particular lie? Do you think it's okay or not? And would you trust your parents if they would tell this lie? Because I'm very curious to see whether the type of lie in that case matters. Because if you're talking about the prosocial lies, the white lies, the false compliments, is it really the case that if you're saying the blunt truth, is that for children the better option? Or would they say, no, I'd rather have my parents sugarcoat things a little bit?
Sure.
So I think that's really important to also get the children's perspective on it. And I think it's important to look at those different types of lies to be able to really answer that question about trust issues. Yeah.
Sure. We have two more. One's from Thalia. I'll just suggest that maybe, Thalia, we hold that off to the group discussion at the end. But a question here from Brandy, the very hopeful Brandy, who tried to help rescue us in Discord. Brandy asks, when lying after that point, the point of a child's disbelief, I think, given the timing of the question, when lying after that point, doesn't that go back to Thalia's point about group pretending? If all parties know it's a lie and we still engage in it, isn't it just for the sake of social or cultural means?
Yeah, and is it then still, if you know your child knows it's not true, is it then still lying? Or does it, because in the definition of lying, there's also a disclaimer that without forewarning, it's in the official definition of the Vrij, that if we're in a situation where we both know that the truth is something else, and we've sort of agreed on that, then is it still lying what we're doing? So maybe then the same kind of behavior gets a different meaning. So I'm not sure if in my research I would still call that lying if the if it is clear for the child that this is no longer that the truth is already out there. So to say.
And Brandy says
and
that makes
confirmed
sense.
by all parties, and then
Yeah.
and then still we put something in our stock. Yeah. I'm not sure if I put something in the shoe of my husband for Sinterklaas that it would be sort of, I would consider it lying myself, because I know he will probably know it's me.
They'll probably piece it together. Yeah.
Yeah. I hope he will.
Brandy, thanks you for your answer there. Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat, so we might take our little comfort break now to go grab a coffee or whatever else it is that you need to do. So it is, by my clock, it's 4:43. So we will come back at the top of the hour at, in my case, 5 p.m. It'll be different for you, but it'll be top of the hour in about 17 minutes. So please go away, relax. Message, you can still use the chat if need be, but we'll catch you all in about 15 minutes again. So we are being recorded. We are recording. We're only a minute or two away. I'll say that a few folks have reached out to me in the private chat here or on Discord to kind of ask questions or talk about something slightly tangential. Please do that. Please reach out. I'm happy to, without naming names, a grad student's like, oh, this is interesting work. And she and I will have a meeting in the new year just to kind of chat about some of these related topics. And I assume that Thalia and Candice and everyone will be, you know, equally open to chatting to grads and other interested people, time permitting. I will also take this moment. I'll drop a link in the chat. So I've put together a little survey. It's not even a survey. That's too rich. It's just a feedback form if you have any critiques or positive things to say about the conference here today. We have been running it. This has zero budget. It's just everyone's volunteering their time, and we're just trying to build it up from scratch. But positive feedback on events like this help us in our departments with outreach metrics. They also help us apply for grants potentially and that make promotion cases. So if you could just click that link, you don't need to say anything. Maybe you can even wait until we finish. But if you did want to take, you know, 30 seconds to say some nice things for us, to us, or even some mean things, that's useful as well. That will actually kind of, that could be very meaningful to us in terms of, you know, career stuff.
This, I might interject that if you do say mean things, you risk not getting any presents.
That's actually what most of the children reported. Be nice to Jackie, be nice to Rowan. Okay, so we've hit the top of the hour, so I've done a little bit of housekeeping there. For those who are just returning, there's a link. Please provide a little bit of feedback. Do reach out to me or any of the other speakers if you have questions. But I might hand over to Thalia to introduce her friend and colleague, Candice.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you guys all for coming back. And just a note for those of you who are just sort of coming back to the computer now, we are being recorded, so just be mindful of that. So I'm thrilled to now pass the baton of the conference to Candice Mills, who will be speaking about debunking the Santa myth. And I have the New York Times link to the editorial that I will post after Candice gives her talk, since I don't want to spoil Christmas. So Candice, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll share my screen. Thumbs up for seeing the screen.
Yep, looks great.
All right, excellent. So Thalia mentioned earlier that there was this advice columnist named Dear Prudence who received a message about 9 years ago or so from a parent who was very concerned about Christmas. More specifically, she was concerned about how to handle discussing Santa Claus with her child. Her husband and her were in conflict. Her husband wanted to keep the lie going as long as possible. She felt some concern about that approach. And Prudence's initial advice was very straightforward. I don't know of anyone who feels harmed or misled by their parents indulging in this magic of Santa, the Easter Bunny, or the Tooth Fairy. She later explained that there's so little magic in the world, why not enjoy it as long as possible? But the response to her advice was severe. And quite a few people wrote and said, I had lots of trouble when I went through figuring out that Santa wasn't real. I felt lied to by my parents. Many concerns were raised. And so Prudence actually took back her advice and clarified her perspective. All right, I'm now hearing from parents who are deeply scarred by believing in Santa, even as puberty approached. Okay, parents, if your kid is near double digits in age, time to get him or her off Santa's knee at the mall and give it to them straight. This conversation illustrates some tension in the Santa myth, right? Because children may believe in Santa when they're younger, but at some point they transition to disbelief in the idea of Santa as one individual figure who travels the world and does all these activities. And so a question that we're really interested in is, how do children transition to disbelief, and what is that aftermath like? And so in our project, the first piece of the puzzle we're interested in is, what is the process by which children become skeptical about Santa? Based on past research looking at how kids form beliefs and change beliefs, we identified 3 main likely processes. The first is logical reasoning. Kids use their understanding of how the world works, what's possible and impossible, to decide that Santa can't actually be real. A second is testimony. So kids can use testimony to decide that Santa's real to begin with, right? They hear from their parents, they hear from their teachers that Santa's real. The form of the testimony may change over time. As kids get older, parents may be more likely to hedge in the way they respond, or a peer at school might tell kids, no, Santa's not actually real. And so testimony may be a path that many kids take to figuring out that Santa isn't real. A third is using evidence from the world to decide that Santa's not real. So along with hearing from others that Santa's real, they get that evidence with presents under the tree from Santa. And so that tells them initially that Santa's real, but in time, it could be that they gather evidence that supports that he isn't. So they could find the wrapping paper that Santa Claus uses inside their parents' closet, or they could see that the handwriting in the Christmas gift looks like it's from mom, not from Santa. And so discovering this evidence from firsthand observation may lead many kids to become skeptical. It is possible that kids use many ones of these. So it could be a combination of these that leads kids to be skeptical. We're also interested in other aspects of how they become skeptical. So is the process abrupt or gradual? And then what is the sort of experience they're having with their families promoting Santa? Does that affect how they might become skeptical? So the second big piece of this is the aftermath. So what happens after kids become skeptical? So the example from Dear Prudence showed that a lot of people wrote in saying that they had been upset and disappointed and lost trust in their parents as a result of this discovery. We wanted to know more about the different kinds of experiences kids had in discovering that Santa was real and characterizing what happened, what tended to happen. Another big question that we were interested in is whether the process by which children become skeptical relates to that feeling afterwards, how negative their reaction is. So for instance, if a child hears the truth from testimony, so a peer at school points out that Santa's not real, is that a harder transition to skepticism for them than figuring it out for themselves through logical reasoning or observation? So for this project, we conducted 2 studies. The first was a set of disbelief interviews with children. The second was a retrospective survey with adults. And I'll talk more about why we did the adult study in a few minutes. But the basic idea behind both studies was the same. For the child study, we had parents confirm disbelief before the interview. For the adult survey, they just had to say they didn't believe anymore when they filled out the survey. And then everybody was asked to provide information about when they figured out that Santa wasn't real, what the process was for their discovery, how they felt afterwards, other aspects of the aftermath, like whether they would celebrate Santa with their own kids. We had some questions about trust and other characters. And then for both groups, we asked questions about how Santa was promoted in the home. For our child group, this was given by the parents. For the adult group, it was reflecting back on their childhoods, what they remembered. So let's start off with the child data. So for this project, we interviewed 48 kids ages 6 to 15 and a half or so. We had 44 parents complete a survey about their Christmas celebrations. The parents reported the demographic information. This was a heavily white, mostly college-educated sample. So we will come back to this in the general discussion to talk about generalization. So let's talk about the process first. So we wanted to ask how old kids were, but when they started to have doubts about Santa's existence. So kids reported roughly a little below age 7 when they started to ask questions, when they started to feel a little bit concerned or questioning. And they reported their age of disbelief to be roughly 7 and a quarter or so. But there was a pretty significant difference in terms of the range of disbelief. So some kids reported disbelieving as early as 4, others as late as 12. We were also interested in the process by which kids become skeptical. And so for this, we had a question that was getting them to talk about their journey to no longer believing in Santa Claus. We then coded their responses to these questions to see what processes they mentioned in their explanation. And so I'll show you the percentages and walk you through a few examples. So logical reasoning was reported by about 15% of our participants. Example of this is we took a big trip to New Zealand and I realized how big the world was, and I thought it was very unreasonable that Santa could fly around the world to everyone's houses in just 24 hours. For testimony, this was by far the most common at 79%. I asked my mom if he was real and she printed out something from Pinterest saying that Santa isn't real. And an experience also came up because every time we could see our mom putting out presents and we could tell. If you look at these percentages, you can see they don't add up to 100. And that's because many kids reported multiple paths to becoming skeptical. So they'll mention a little bit of observation mixed in with some testimony, or some logical reasoning mixed in with some testimony. So there was not just one path for many kids. We also coded whether they suggested the transition was abrupt or gradual. For most of the kids in this study, they reported that it was gradual. About 18% mentioned that it seemed to be abrupt, and the rest said a mixture of both or didn't make it clear. So at least for our child sample, it wasn't that this was an abrupt experience for many kids. For many, it was gradual. Next, we turned to the aftermath. So we were interested in how they reported they felt when they discovered that Santa wasn't real. And as you can see, about a third of them reported feeling sad. You can see that 16.7 reported being angry. But a good number of kids reported being happy about it. And the happiness took different forms. Sometimes it was happy that they figured out. Sometimes it was happy that they were still going to get gifts. We were kind of surprised by how many kids reported that sort of feeling as a result of discovering that Santa wasn't real. Next, we asked questions around trust. So do you trust your parents less knowing that they told you that Santa was real, even though he isn't? And the majority of kids said they trusted their parents the same. 21% said less. We asked if kids would teach their own kids about Santa. Now, this is a really weird question to ask a 7-year-old, right? Can you imagine that when you were a grown-up, you'll teach your kids about Santa? But still, almost 70% said yes, about 18% said maybe, 8% said no, and most of these were like, I have no idea if I'm gonna have kids. This is a strange question to ask me. So the kids that we were talking to felt like Santa was something that they wanted to continue themselves. Next, we wanted to look at the link between the process by which they became skeptical and the aftermath. And I'll mention here that our sample here is only 48 kids, so we don't have much variability to work with here. But what we could do is at least compare the kids who reported some negative emotions to those who did not report any negative emotions and see how their processes differed, basically. In short, these groups did not vary in the age of discovery, not in terms of whether they were abrupt or gradual in the discovery, not in terms of their trust in their parents. The main difference was that in this sample of the smaller sample of kids, the kids who have reported experiencing some negative emotions were more likely to have reported Santa promotion, so greater levels of Santa promotion. So putting this a different way, kids who had Santa promoted at home were more likely to feel negative emotions about the discovery than those who didn't. Santa promotion can take many forms. Thalia and others have talked about this a bit so far. In this particular study, we had a survey and parents could check off which activities they engaged in with their kid related to Santa, such as having gifts for Santa, having visits with Santa, whether virtually or in person, tracking Santa's location during the holiday, and so on. All right, so big picture before we move on to the adults. Testimony was the most common process by which kids become skeptical, followed by experience, little logical reasoning mixed in. The aftermath, there was some sadness, but also some happiness. Almost all planned to celebrate Santa with their own kids. I'll mention briefly here that a challenge with this study was recruiting enough kids to participate. We wondered if the kids who agreed to participate are special somehow because they've admitted to their parents that they no longer believed in Santa. And we also noted that some kids were interviewed having their parents sit nearby, and some may not have felt comfortable admitting all of their emotions. So we felt like this was justification to try to work with adults to try to see what adults remembered about the process of becoming skeptical. So I'll just mention briefly here, 383 participants, wide age range. So some people looking back dozens of years, mostly white, mostly college educated. We'll get back to this again in the general discussion. So in terms of the process by which kids became skeptical or adults reported becoming skeptical, the average age of skepticism was around 8.5, so a bit older than our child sample. And the vast majority were able to remember something about how they figured out the truth about Santa. So this kind of showed that there is something about the experience that stuck with them. So I'll show you the data for how they became skeptical. I have the data for kids here in comparison, but you can see it's pretty similar for the kids and the adults looking back at their childhoods. The most common way that adults reported becoming skeptical was through testimony, like hearing from a peer or a teacher or a parent. Experience was second on the list, and then third was logical reasoning. In terms of whether it happened abruptly or gradually, we had a bit more people reporting abrupt in this study, so around 31% as opposed to around 20% with the kids, but many didn't remember the specifics. We also, in this study, were able to ask people if they hid their beliefs about Santa. And it's important to note that 61% of them reported hiding their beliefs in some way, whether that be from their peers or from their parents or from others. So this, again, gives more credence to having this kind of study, because we are not going to be able to find enough kids to participate just by interviewing kids, because many kids are not revealing to their parents that they've become skeptical. Next, we looked at the aftermath. So how did people report feeling when they discovered that Santa was not real? So a little bit more sadness reported by the adults than the kids we studied in study 1. Less happiness, although you can see that there's a little bit more pride in the mix. So maybe the adults are just kind of articulating the happiness feeling is about the pride as opposed to just in general better than the kids. But still, more sadness with the adults. Adults also were able to provide more nuanced emotions than our kids. So we noticed quite a few adults just saying, I felt fine. I felt neutral. And then we noticed some mixed feelings as well. We were able with this study to get a sense of how long the reaction lasted. And we were also able to break it down by whether this was a reaction to a negative emotion or to a positive emotion. And so I'll just mention that for those who experienced only negative feelings at discovering the truth about Santa, 27% said the feeling lasted more than several months or longer. For those who felt mixed feelings or positive feelings or neutral feelings, 37% said it lasted several months or longer. So you can see that distinction there. It's fewer feeling negative emotions for a longer period of time. We were also interested in whether this experience affected beliefs about fantastical characters and parts of their religion. These are questions we didn't feel comfortable asking with the kids, but we felt like we could ask with our adults. And so for fantastical characters, we found that about 42% reported that they became skeptical of the Tooth Fairy or the Easter Bunny as a result of discovering the truth about Santa. We also asked if this raised questions about aspects of their religion, such as religious figures or religious texts. And most people said no, or I don't remember, but there was a subset of participants who did report that this experience of discovering the truth about Santa raised questions to them about aspects of their religion. Next, we asked adults, just like we'd ask the kids, do you plan to teach your kids about Santa? Of those who plan to have kids, 90% said yes. So with both groups, there's this clear plan to celebrate Santa with their own kids. They had lots of reasons for that, mostly involving how joyful the experience of Santa can be, and occasionally that societal norms make them feel like they should, but they're not sure how they feel about it. Of those who said no, it tended to be for concerns about disappointment or concerns about it affecting kids' reasoning and their ability to think logically about things. All right, big picture. With this sample, we were able to look at the link between process and aftermath with more power, right? We have 383 participants instead of 48. And so we looked at, again, the adults who recalled negative emotions to see how they differed from those who didn't. Those who recalled negative emotions experienced more Santa promotion activities, just like in study 1. But we also were able to get a little bit more information here. They tended to be older upon discovering the truth. They were more likely to have reported discovering the truth abruptly, and they were more likely to have learned the truth through testimony, like a peer telling them, for instance, and not through experience or logical reasoning. Interestingly, those people who had experienced only negative emotions were just as likely to plan to teach their kids about Santa as those who did not. So just because someone felt sad about discovering the truth about Santa did not mean that they didn't want to do it themselves, if that makes sense. All right, I'm going to quickly go through the conclusions. So we saw that testimony was a significant force of disbelief, followed by experience and then logical reasoning. I had personally hoped there would be more logical reasoning in the mix, but we could talk more about why there might not be in the discussion. Children reported coming to disbelief gradually. Adults reported more variability. In general, people who reported experiencing negative emotions had received more Santa promotion than those who didn't. And then at least with our adult sample, we saw that age, abruptness of discovery, and learning through testimony were more likely to lead to negative emotions. But I want to point out some big picture things we want to keep in mind here. First, the vast majority still plan to teach their kids about Santa. So even if they'd had some negative experiences, they still want to continue the Santa tradition overall. One big question we have is, what does Santa promotion look like in practice? And so we have this measure of Santa promotion that's basically checking off some boxes about what kind of activities they engage in with their kids. But just because you take your kids to the mall to see Santa doesn't mean you approach it the same way as someone else who takes their kids to the mall to talk about Santa. So the way kids ask questions about Santa and how the parents respond to their kids about Santa may reveal important things about how Santa is being promoted in the home. So we have 2 studies, both with data collection finished, related to what Santa promotion looks like in practice. So one is a naturalistic report of parent-child conversation, basically parent diaries during the holiday season. The other is a prompted explanation task where parents are asked to respond to a set of questions as if they're talking to a child out loud. We transcribe and code for the kinds of characteristics they include in their explanations to kids. So our hope is that this information will give us some data about how parents tend to respond to their kids, as well as what sort of features may be more likely to lead to a positive transition to skepticism than others. Another thing I've mentioned a few times during the talk is that we have very little information about demographic and cultural differences in how Santa is promoted and how children transition from trust to skepticism. This came up recently in a conversation with a reporter from Denmark. He just kept on asking me, but why do you promote Santa so hard? But why? And it was a really interesting discussion that made me think a lot about how much variability there may be in the level of promotion, the type of promotion, and then the experience kids go as they're transitioning through trust to skepticism. And finally, one thing we don't have data on from this project is what factors influence the intensity of children's reactions to the truth. So we have this sort of blunt force of, did you feel sad or angry? They reported that, but we don't know how deeply they feel like they had those emotions. And so we think following up on those kids who have a hard time and have felt like it's stuck with them should provide some meaningful information for caregivers when they're thinking about how to approach the Santa Claus myth. In there, I want to mention I have a QR code to our study on there, but I think Thalia was also sharing it on a separate link. I also want to thank the social media platform formerly known as Twitter for helping Thalia and I find each other to do this project, and then our lab teams at George Mason and UT Dallas. Thank you. And I will minimize my slides. Is my screen no longer shared?
Yes, your screen is no longer shared.
Okay, I am happy to discuss questions.
Awesome. So yeah, so we have about 10 minutes for questions. So everyone, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. We have a first question from Christina. What were the ages of the adults again? I wonder how it might be different to ask adolescents recollection questions since it was more recent. I would also be curious about a longitudinal study and how many children and adolescents it included initially report they would or wouldn't promote Santa and then follow through in parenthood. Great presentation.
Thank you. Lots of interesting things to think about. So the ages of adults, it was widespread, 18 to like 78 or so. And so I think you're right, the ages of adults may make a difference. Thalia and I hadn't been thinking about this as a study of memory exactly, but this is in some ways a study of memory, right? And the construction of memory. And so one of the things that we've wondered about our adult participants is that they're looking back through some sort of lens, whether that be a cultural lens or an experience lens that affects how they're thinking about their childhood experience. I think studying adolescents would be really wonderful to be able to get them after they've stopped believing, but with enough space between the experience that they have a closeness, but enough distance to be able to be calmer about it, perhaps. We'd also be really interested in following kids longitudinally too, as they start to make sense of Santa. Tricky to do, of course, because a lot of parents don't want people to talk to their kids about Santa because they don't want the myth to be busted. So we want to tread very cautiously there.
Great. Joe asks, was it difficult to recruit children for the study? Perhaps some parents don't want their children's belief in Santa to be questioned, as you just mentioned. Do you want to say anything else about that, about these difficulties and how we got those kids?
It was extremely hard. And we actually started this as a Zoom study before everything went virtual for COVID, because we felt like we needed to go as far as people needed to be to talk about Santa. So a lot of times university professors will focusing on kids near their labs. And we wanted to go broad to find kids to participate, but it was hard. And because we've seen so many kids, so many adults report that they hid it from their parents, we are confident that the kids that we're talking to don't represent all the kids. And so it's really important to have this child data and the adult data to make sense of the experiences people have.
Yeah. So Rachel asks, given that children who had negative emotions who are more likely to learn through testimony and abruptly, is it possible that coming to realize the Santa myth on one's own through logical reasoning or experience leads to more positive experiences for children? And if this is the case, would you advise parents to promote their child's logical reasoning and perhaps leave some breadcrumb trails to help their child discover the truth?
I love that idea. And I think we would cautiously suggest that based on the data we've seen so far. So the opposite was found that if they had a learned through experience and logical reasoning, they were less likely to have those negative feelings. So potentially, I think also, like I'd said before, we don't know exactly how parents are promoting Santa. And so the content of the explanations they're giving to kids could change over time, where they deflect to their child more and ask them more of what they think, so that they can start processing it themselves to figure out the truth. But I still think there's a lot we don't know, particularly about the kids who've held that grudge. So there are a subset of kids who it has been a very negative experience, and they hold it with them and they distrust their parents for longer periods of time. And so I think we do need to understand more about the experience those kids have had to give more general advice to avoid something like that.
Two questions about age, one first from Patricia and then the second from Alex. So first, is there a link between age of discovery and the abrupt gradual dimension? The intuition is that younger kids would be less likely to connect the dots suddenly or to know what to do with conflicting testimony from parents and peers. And then the second question is age versus cohort effects. Do you think that when someone was a child might impact how they come to learn about Santa Claus?
I'll start with the abrupt versus gradual distinction piece. I think that's an important question with our child data, because it was a small sample. We didn't have that many people experience it abruptly. We don't know. With our adult sample, my memory is that the kids who reported learning abruptly were older. And I think in some cases that was a testimony kind of thing, where they were hearing a peer tell them, no, Santa's not real, and it felt like an abrupt discovery. But I think there's more that we need to look at to understand that. Related to cohort effects, I think that's an interesting question. One of the things that Thalia and I've looked at is the way Santa's been promoted over time. So more like discussed and explored. Santa is sometimes talked about through movies as this character that kids start to have disbelief in, but then they become to reaffirm their belief at the end of the story. And there's all these technological things we can do to track Santa and show Santa in a living room and all sorts of things like that can make it easier to extend our belief. But on the other hand, ask Google if Santa is not real, or talk to Alexa about it, or ask Siri. There are also many sources of information for kids to realize that he isn't real. So I do think there's interesting things about how experiences around Santa have changed over time that could play a role in how kids are approaching it. Also, Elf on a Shelf. We haven't talked about that, but that did not exist when I was a kid, but it's very popular now. For those who don't know, the Elf on the Shelf will spy on our kids to make sure they're behaving well and report back to Santa at night, and then move in the house at night to be in a different place in the morning. It is a spy for behavioral control. And so it's a daily kind of reinforcement of Santa existing, because the elf is directly connected to Santa. And so that cultural artifact may be influencing beliefs.
One more question about age that I missed from Jay, and I'm sorry about that, Jay, and thank you, Christina, for pointing it out. Did you look at any variables that correlate with age of disbelief for the adults, such as if age of disbelief predicts beliefs in things like conspiracy theories, alternative medicine, or these other kinds of more supernatural beliefs in adulthood?
We don't. I'd be curious to talk to you more about that. I think that so the average age of adults they're reporting is around 8.5 of discovery, yet some discover it less or later. And the question about why do they discover it later? What is going on that makes a 14-year-old still believe that Santa is real? There's a lot of things that could be going on there that could be based both on the child and on the context around the child that are really interesting. So some kids may be more fantasy driven. Ty and I have talked about this with some of the reporters we've discussed about this project. There are some kids, when they ask you, how does Santa get down the chimney? They want to play the story. They want to know how that could happen and still maintain their trust in Santa. So other kids are like, I want to know logically what happens and how this works. And I want you to tell me, and I'm going to be mad if you don't tell me the logical truth. And so that sort of individual, what the child is bringing to the table may influence their belief. And then, of course, there's a cultural component of that can affect the age that they disbelieve.
All right, and one more question from Rebecca, which is the emotion words that were used to describe the reactions are quite limited. Were these dictated by the children themselves, or did you code other things into broad categories? For example, I was surprised not to see words like embarrassed or hurt on the list, particularly by students who probably heard it on the playground. And thank you for this, very interesting.
Yes. So coding what the kids said was a terrible experience. Let me back that up. It was really fun to code their transition to skepticism and how they figured it out. Trying to make sense of their emotions when we did not give them a multiple choice option or tell us, did you feel this way? Did you feel that way? We wanted to come organically from the kids. But as you know, kids can vary a lot in terms of their vocabulary for describing their emotions and putting into context how they feel. And so we did get adults reporting things like embarrassed, hurt, ambivalence in terms of different directions, a lot of richness from the emotional categories from the adults. From the kids, we could we slotted it into these kind of categories and didn't get much beyond that. But I think that next time we would do an interview study like this, we would want to include some questions to try to get more specifically both different kinds of feelings, but also the intensity of those sorts of feelings. There's some scales that you can have kids fill out where they're basically showing how intensely they felt something. If they felt it just a little bit, it's like a little dot. And if they felt it really strongly, it's like a fireworks in their stomach. And to try to get at the levels of emotion and intensity, I think that would be really helpful.
Great. Thank you so much, Candace, for this wonderful talk. And thank you everyone for your great questions. Just two quick notes. The first is Rohan has asked ChatGPT whether Santa Claus is real, talking about like modern ways to find out the truth. And so everyone can pop into the chat and take a look that saying Santa Claus is a legendary figure associated with Christmas tradition, bringing gifts to children on Christmas Eve. But Santa Claus is generally considered a fictional character, apparently. Not absolute, but generally considered a fictional character, which is awesome. And then I'm also going to put into the chat the New York Times guest essay op-ed that Candace and I wrote on talking to kids about Santa and some preliminary, very cautious recommendations that we've made based on the findings from this study. And with that, we will now turn it over to Jackie Woolley for the last formal talk of the afternoon or evening or wherever time zone you find yourself in at this moment. And then, but Rohan, do you have something quick first?
Yeah, just to add that, so Jackie will give us her talk and there'll be some questions for Jackie specifically. Following that, that'll be 30 minutes of open Q&A from the audience. Which you can pose to any one of us or combinations thereof. And the final half hour after that will be just the five of us kind of reflecting on the state of the field and kind of thoughts that have arisen in the context of each other's speeches. So after Jackie, 30 minutes for you all, and then 30 minutes for us to speak to you.
Great. So Jackie, you should be able to take it away.
Great. Okay. The host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, no. Hang on. You should be a co-host.
I know I have been because I've been letting people in the whole time. So I was a
I think when you signed out for the break. Here we go.
Oh, that's what happened.
You should be a co-host now.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, and I can see your screen. Yes, I can see your screen.
Can you see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
I mean, right.
Yes,
so
we can see
okay?
we can see you and the slides. Go right ahead.
Okay, excellent. Great. Okay, I can't see myself. I can only see the slides. But hold on a second. Okay. Okay, we got it. All right. Hi, everyone. My talk will be a little bit different. I'm warning you. I'm not going to be sharing any data at all today. So this will just be a theoretical talk that hopefully leads to a lot of conversation. So I'm just going to lay out some ideas, and I hope that these ideas will stimulate some discussion and hopefully inspire some research too. So the goal of my talk today is just to get us all thinking about relations between belief in Santa and belief in God. And first, just a caveat, my thinking thus far is really limited primarily to children's beliefs in a Judeo-Christian God, just because that's what the samples that I have utilized in this talk use. But it'd be really great if during the brainstorming session later, we could talk about other cultures and other religious traditions as people have mentioned already. So I'm going to begin by considering what children in the US think about these two beings. And in doing so, I'm going to draw really heavily on this wonderful book by Cindy Dale Clark that many of you may be familiar with. It's called Flights of Fancy, Leaps of Faith. And Clark interviewed about 100 5 to 10-year-old children and their parents about Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy in this book. And the conversations were absolutely fascinating. But one of the things I've always found most intriguing was that children sometimes linked God with all of these fantastical beings. So, as I've read the book, I've gone through and highlighted this every time. And for example, what they did is they attributed similar properties to them. And interestingly, they sometimes suggested that they knew each other. So how did they link Santa and God? Well, if you think about God's properties, he's immortal, omniscient. He has supernatural powers, can perform seemingly magical acts, and he often enforces moral behavior. So kids in Clark's study referenced a lot of these things and said mentioned other properties that are similar. So they said that he knows if you've been bad or good. So he's clearly checking on their moral behavior. He's concerned with their welfare. He's up there watching them all the time. He accepts offerings in the form of cookies and milk. And you can actually also sort of pray to him, by writing a letter. One of my favorite quotes from this book is the following. It's a mom talking about her child, and she says, "We go to church and he has CCD classes, and they're taught that God sees everything and he knows. He knows what you're doing and when you're doing it. If you need help, he's there, and he watches over you." And I think what I was telling him about Santa one time, about being good. Santa knows if you don't behave. He kind of got the same feeling. Oh, well, Santa watches over me all year round too. He says, is he like God? Does he do the same things God does? And as I mentioned, some kids even think Santa and God know each other. So one child in Clark's study said that Santa and God were neighbors. He said, I think they know each other. Santa was flying and God was outside watering his flowers. And then they started talking and got to be friends. And interestingly, children even claimed that God knew other fantastical beings, like the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny. So one child volunteered that not only does God ask Santa to bring presents, but that he also asks Easter Bunny to bring eggs. And another child, interestingly, thought that God was the one that gave the Tooth Fairy her job. So Clark asked, how did the Tooth Fairy get started doing this, do you suppose? Probably God made them. One day, Adam or Eve, either one, lost their tooth and didn't know what to do with it. So God spoke to them and she told them, put your tooth when you're sleeping and it'll go away and you'll get something for it. Well, what did the Tooth Fairy think about getting the job? Happy, because not too many people get to see God while they're living. And then the Tooth Fairy got to see him anytime that she wanted to. One child even reported that the Easter Bunny and God lived together. So to a cognitive scientist, to all of us probably, this is absolutely fascinating and wonderful, and potentially reveals a lot about how children reason about the unobservable. But to some, particularly those aiming to raise their children in a religious tradition, this linking of God and Santa is problematic. So one child in Clark's book referred to Santa as the, quote, God of presence, which raised some parental concern that this could lead to a concept of God that's centered around his gift-giving potential rather than his many other attributes. And I think probably the Keep Christ in Christmas bumper stickers that I see around town this time of year may reflect this sentiment as well. Another concern, mostly from fundamentalist Christian parents, was that false idols are being created by this culture of fantastical beings. So according to them, only God should possess all those properties, omniscience, immortality, etc. Essentially, I think that they don't want Santa competing with God for their child's attention. But perhaps the most consequential concern is about belief in God's existence. Some parents are reluctant to endorse or participate in the Santa Claus myth. I think we heard a quote about this earlier, for fear that once their children find out that Santa Claus isn't real, they'll begin to question God's reality status. I don't know if any of you have come across the Jehovah's Witness pamphlet that they pass out when they're in the neighborhood. It's called Awake. And in one version of this, they make this argument, and they report an interview with a child who was apparently disillusioned with Santa, or about Santa, and told his friend that, quote, "Yes, and I'm going to look into this Jesus Christ business too." Now, these concerns actually do turn out to be borne out sometimes, at least anecdotally. So this is a quote from Cindy Scheib, a child that Cindy Scheib interviewed. She says, one father told of the son asking him if he was really Santa Claus. The father had admitted that he was, after which the boy thought for a while and then asked if his father was also the tooth fairy. Again, the father admitted that he was. The son then asked if the father was also the Easter bunny, and when the father said yes, the son asked, "Are you God too?" And this is another one I couldn't resist sharing with you as well. This is from Cindy Dell Clark's study. She talks about a mom who was telling her children about how God makes the trees and the sun, and her child responded with a question of her own. She said, "Well, does he make the signs?" They were driving at the time. Great, best time to have conversations like this with your kids is when you're driving. To which the mom responded negatively and reminded her child that God made the flowers. To which her daughter responded, "I don't believe in God and Santa Claus. How come they never die?" Now, I think these similarities can potentially, between Santa and God, can actually be problematic in the opposite direction as well. So for those committed to raising their children without religion, Santa belief may be a concern. So Pascal Boyer, for example, discusses Santa as the perfect blueprint for eventual belief in God. So possibly once you start believing in Santa, it's just a slippery slope to believing in God. In this context, I recently saw Santa referred to as, quote, "God with training wheels." So on this view, belief in Santa may actually promote belief in God. But it really can't be both, can it? Belief in Santa can't both threaten and support belief in God. So which is it? Well, we don't know. Ultimately, this question hasn't really been addressed, and we'll talk about that. But what makes it super interesting is that there's reason to think it could go in a lot of different, or at least 3 different directions. So first of all, belief in fantastical beings like Santa might promote belief in God, or belief in Santa and the inevitable disbelief might negatively affect belief in God, or there may actually just be no causal relation at all between Santa belief and God belief. So I'm going to explore these in as much detail as I can, given limited data, and hopefully this will inspire us to collect more data on these questions. So let's start with this one. Belief in Santa increases belief in God. Now, I think there are, well, at least 2 different theoretical proposals for how this would happen. One, okay, we'll keep this slide up here. One starts in my mind with Justin Barrett proposing, and others proposing, that we're predisposed to believe in God. But I think maybe more generally, I could suggest that we're predisposed to believe that someone or something is in control of our lives. And for those of us who are uncomfortable with uncertainty, the idea of someone running the show is quite appealing. Here, Santa would be the earlier, kind of more accessible choice to play this role, with God being the eventual sort of ultimate version. And many of us may have this need for such a figure, and Santa perhaps provides a starting point for fulfilling this need, which is eventually taken over by God. So that's kind of one way this could happen. But a slightly different view is presented by Cindy Dell Clark in her book. She proposes, also that believing in fantastical beings like Santa promotes belief in God, but more critically, it promotes the capacity for faith. And that leads to increased belief in God. And she suggests that children might conceive of Santa Claus as being a part of a supernatural reality. And then she goes on to state that, like belief in God, belief in Santa Claus amounts to an act of faith, requiring a suspension of disbelief on the part of the believing subject. So faith is the key word here. She argues that children learn faith from believing in Santa Claus. And not only do they learn it, but at the same time, they're experiencing a faith that is endorsed by their parents and culture. She argues that this capacity for faith in a higher transcendent reality does not go away when children find out about Santa Claus. Instead, when children find out that Santa Claus isn't physically or literally real, they can retain belief in what Santa Claus is meant to symbolize. And then this then bolsters their capacity for faith. I've always found this to be an extremely intriguing proposal. Is it testable? Well, I don't know, but questions we'd have to answer might include, how would we measure this sort of faith? How might we assess understanding of Santa's symbolic nature? Those kinds of questions. As far as evidence goes, is there any evidence that believing in Santa helps children believe in God? Well, there is some that's potentially relevant. In some of my earlier work on fantasy, Tanya, Sharon, and I found that belief in Santa is related to belief in other unobservable beings, like the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny. Beth Berger and I also found that children who believe in more fantastical beings were more likely to believe in a novel fantastical entity like the Candy Witch. And here we propose that children might have a network of existing fantastical beings, and then the presence of this network can then facilitate belief in new beings. So following from this, you might argue that, if children have this sort of network, including a belief in Santa Claus, that might actually, allow God to sort of join that network or facilitate belief in God. But of course, this network idea raises other issues. So we'll jump to the next possibility, which is that believing in Santa negatively affects belief in God. So let's say that kids have these networks. So, as was hinted at by some of the quotes that I shared with you earlier, disbelief in one member of the network could potentially cause the whole network to collapse. So if God's included in this network, which the anecdotal evidence that I read earlier suggests he is, then there's strong potential for negative effects on God belief upon finding out the truth about these other fantastical beings. And I love this. Candace didn't use this quote in her talk, but the recent work by Candace and her colleagues that you heard about basically asked children some questions related to this domino effect. And this is one of my favorite quotes that they report. This child said, but then when I figured out that Santa isn't real, I figured out, oh, if Santa isn't real, that means the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, and every single thing that you believe in isn't real. Like, I don't know what they meant by this last sentence, but maybe Candace does. Like, you can't actually go to the end of the rainbow because it would just know. And as Candace mentioned in her talk, they actually talked to adults about some of these things as well. And sorry, I just didn't mean to pop that. But yeah, so they talked to adults about some of these questions as well, and actually suggest that their work suggests that maybe there is a causal relation here. And so they asked parents if finding out if Santa wasn't real caused their children to question the existence of other fictional beings, like, the Tooth Fairy and Easter Bunny, and they found that parents of kids said that they did. And then in the other study with adults, they found that about 43 remembered their own Santa disbelief, leading to disbeliefs in other fantastical beings. So it does seem to be possibly the case that disbelief in Santa leads to disbelief in other fantastical beings. But how does this relate to belief in God, or how might this relate with God? Well, one is clearly that there's this domino effect, that maybe to the extent to which God is a part of these networks, when children lose their belief in Santa, everything just sort of topples down. But it could also be mediated by trust. So maybe, Santa Claus disbelief leads to a distrust with parents, and then this leads to God. And again, Mills' work addresses this. Mills et al., interviewed these kids who stopped believing in Santa, and they found that most of them said that actually they trusted their parents the same as they had before. So, maybe it's not this. Maybe it's not mediated by trust. We don't know yet. And one other thing I wanted to mention about this process is that we need to be thinking about two possibilities. I mean, one possibility is that if Santa disbelief may lead to just a permanent disbelief in God. But it may also lead to a temporary kind of dip. So maybe children just stop believing in God for a minute and then it sort of comes back eventually. So there might be sort of a dip in God belief, but then maybe God belief is even strengthened. You know, when your faith is sort of temporarily questioned, it ends up coming back even more strongly. So, and that might be in line with Cindy Dale Clark's idea. So we have to think about if there is an effect on God belief, is it short-lived or long-lived? But on to the third possibility. That's this one. There may be no causal relation at all between Santa belief and God belief. And again, like all of this talk, there's not a whole lot of evidence yet. But as you heard in Candace's talk, they also asked this question. They addressed in adults whether Santa disbelief caused disbelief in religious beings and events. And they found that most people said no, that there was no effect. So maybe there aren't effects of Santa disbelief on belief in God. But, you know, these were retrospective reports, so maybe they, you know, just didn't remember it happening, which would seem especially likely if the disbelief was just very short-lived. And what might be interesting to eventually look at is to see whether there is this sort of short-lived dip in God belief or even permanent, you know, God disbelief relative to what happens with these fantastical beings like the tooth fairy. Presumably, belief in God could survive the after effects of Santa disbelief because of the enduring supportive testimony that children continue to receive about God in comparison to these other fantastical beings. So perhaps if kids do have these links between Santa and God, then belief in Santa affects belief in God, whereas if they don't form these links, there's no causal relation. So it could be kind of, you know, 2 out of these 3 possibilities could happen. There could be really interesting individual differences. But of course, we need to figure out what factors affect whether, you know, kids link Santa and God in the first place. And one of these is clearly, you know, how these beings are talked about by children's parents and others. And I think Candace and Thalia are going to get at this with their research. So that's one, you know, thing that we need to look at and consider. We also need to think about the effects of the role of family religiosity, which includes not only, you know, religious identity, but also religious beliefs and practices. And then finally, we need to look at, you know, parent promotion and endorsement of Santa, as we've all been talking about, and what effect that has on the links that kids might form between Santa and God. So again, the hypothesis would be that the extent to which kids link these beings would determine the causal effects of Santa disbelief on belief in God. So given all of this sort of theoretical rambling, I would love to for us to have some time to brainstorm and maybe figure out how we would do this research. I think, you know, just bare bones, what we really want is information about God from kids who, you know, first believed in Santa versus those who didn't first believe in Santa. Something like that would be wonderful. That would be the sort of the kind of data that we might want to collect. But, you know, this is difficult, as we've talked about, given the high level of belief in Santa, especially among younger kids. That's whom we'd probably want to target, you know, the whatever 3 to 7-year-olds or something. Such a high level of belief in Santa, at least in the US. And then we'd also want some kind of microanalysis of the Santa disbelief process, like, you know, Thalia and Candace are doing, and also immediate effects on belief in God. So ideally, we'd kind of catch kids when they start to doubt, follow them through until disbelief, and then affect belief in God at various points during that timeline. So yeah, it would have to be, this would have to be a longitudinal study, obviously, maybe spanning, I don't know, 4 to 10 or 4 to 12, I don't know. So yeah, what kind of data would we want to collect? Well, we'd want to collect data on Santa belief and certainty. How sure are you? Very sure, a little sure. We'd obviously want the same for God belief and certainty. Again, as I mentioned, it'd be interesting to collect data on other fantastical beings because we could maybe compare then the effects of Santa disbelief on these beings with effects on God belief. And then I think it'll also be interesting to collect property attributions for both God and Santa. So maybe the God beliefs of children with more overlap in these attributions would be more affected by Santa disbelief than kids who have, fewer points of overlap. Obviously, we'd need to look at parent testimony. One thing to look at, and there are many, obviously, but would be to code the context in which these beings are discussed. So Santa might be discussed just regarding the approach of Christmas, whereas God might be discussed more generally and more regularly. But then also maybe we could look at more subtle differences as well in how parents talk about these two beings. So some other work that I've done with Rebecca Dorr shows that kids can pick up on really nuanced ways that parents talk about what's real and what's not real. And so it'd be great to look at that. We could maybe use the Child Is database, which, as many of you know, is an online sort of repository for conversations between parents and kids. But we could also maybe even bring parents and kids into the lab and then use Luke or a similar text analysis program to kind of look for themes in what they talk about. And then obviously we need to know more about parent promotion, and that's come up a lot today. But then kind of also, as others have also mentioned, just more kind of interactional data would be great. So what kinds of spontaneous questions do kids ask about God? And what are some of the parental cues that prompt these questions? That might differ from family to family. And then obviously, when are these questions asked, around Christmas or not? And again, we could look at, using the Child Is database or just do surveys somehow. And then of course, how are parents answering these questions? Also looking at religious practices, et cetera, because that would presumably influence how they respond. Of course, it would influence, as I said, what kids ask about in the first place. And I think Candace and Thalia will probably be able to get at some of this more. And then just a couple issues that come up. Obviously, there are so many issues that come up in figuring out whether we can ever know the answer to this question, but we can at least try. And one is just how much can we ask kids about God without making kids and parents uncomfortable? And in our studies, what we normally do is we just give kids sort of a battery of reality status questions that include lots of real things, lots of pretend things, and then also God and Santa in there somewhere. And I think that works pretty well because God isn't specifically targeted, and also God isn't linked with Santa in an obvious way. They're just kind of, there are lots of distractors, I guess. That's how we've done it so far. But, to get more sort of nuanced questions might be difficult. But yeah, I wonder if we could do things like Stillman and you did, where they asked kids if they had questions about God, what kind of questions that they had about God. And then obviously the timing and frequency that came up, Rohan was looking at that very cleverly. But, when would we ask kids these questions? I mean, ideally, kind of like what Rohan did, I guess I was thinking sort of before Christmas, like December 15th or something. After Christmas, maybe January 15th, and then maybe July 15th, just to see what's going on when it's not Christmas time. But also, like, maybe we could get somehow parents to complete diaries of children's questions or comments that link Santa and God. And I don't know how we would do that, but, maybe have something pop up on their smartphone where we ask them, once a week to let us know if there were any questions. That might be really cool. So anyway, that's kind of what I've got for today, which really brings us to the most important question, which is, what do you guys think? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jackie. It's always a pleasure to hear you talk on these and other topics. We can maybe chat off air a little bit, but I have some good news. I have a substantial sum of money for a year-long longitudinal study where we can probe parents every month.
Nice.
About things. So maybe we'll talk about that at a later point.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so fantastic stuff, really interesting. There's a few questions in the chat. So I'll ask a couple of those, and then we're going to transition into the open question time. So start thinking about if you want to ask Rianne or Thalia or anyone who's spoken previously, but I will focus on Jackie for the next 10 minutes or so. Jackie, there's a question here from Jay. He had to pop out early, so I am going to take the liberty of paraphrasing his question a little bit, given the context of the latter half of your talk. you were treating Santa, the relationship between Santa belief and God belief as like either a supporting belief or either a challenging belief. Could there be mediating or interacting factors which make it supporting for some or challenging for others?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, obviously, the parental goals are critical here about about God belief, right? So clearly, parents who are trying to raise their child in a religious family, there are going to be different kinds of interactions than parents who are trying to raise their kids as non-religious. So I think, so I think Santa belief could promote belief for some, depending upon, again, it's just all going to depend on the familial context. I think that's just going to be a really big factor, testimony. Yeah.
Great. I have a question here from AC. Please correct me if I'm mispronouncing that, AC. Wonderful talk. I wonder if different mechanisms might be responsible for belief versus disbelief in supernatural beings. Testimony seems to be responsible for belief in Santa, based on Candace's talk and previous research. But what about disbelief? Any predictions?
Yeah, I think different factors probably do affect. There are different factors for belief and for disbelief. And like thinking of like, I can't see the question, so I was just kind of listening to you. But was it a 2x2? So basically, like Santa versus God, and then belief versus disbelief. You could sort of imagine making a 2x2 and thinking about the factors that go into each box. That would be a really fun exercise that we could do. But
do you think there's like do you think there's an equal like a mom and dad say Santa is real? Do you think that is equally powerful as testimony as, I don't know, your cousin telling you that Santa is not real?
Right. Yeah, right. That's a good question. Which is more powerful of those two? It depends probably on where the kid is in his or her belief level at that point. And again, there's so many factors, but parents are authority figures. So I think, early on, kids are going to believe their parents, but later they're going to maybe be more likely to believe their peers. If kids, there's also the issue of motivation. So if most kids, I think, want to believe in Santa for as long as possible. There's maybe the fear of not getting any presents, which is why they hide it from their parents, I think. But then maybe at some point, if a kid's heard enough from their peers, they start maybe prioritizing finding out the truth over continuing to believe. So yeah, I think they're just interesting interactions at all of those levels. I mean, there's also the different roles of experience. I think, the evidence collection issue is different, so the handwriting, there's all kinds of evidence that kids can use with regard to Santa to bolster their belief. Like the cookies are gone when they wake up in the morning, the presents are there. But then there's all kinds of evidence that may threaten the belief. The handwriting on all of the presents looks like your mom's. But with regard to God, it's not really clear what this would be.
Great, thank you. Rianne has some thoughts, but Rianne, I might ask you to, we'll save them for the final segment. There are a bunch of questions here, actually. Brandy asks, do we think some children organize beings within their supernatural belief network hierarchically? God is taught to be above and beyond all, and then you have key figures that either pick up your teeth or give gifts. Do you think lower level supernatural characters do not necessarily influence higher level supernatural characters? Do kids see God as creating Santa and the Tooth Fairy?
That's great. I mean, some of those quotes suggest, yeah, right? Like God gave the Tooth Fairy her job, but they're also, maybe neighbors. They know each other. So I think that the Child's Pantheon, the paper work that you guys did addresses this. But yeah, I think there is a hierarchy. I mean, there's another wonderful book that I could have drawn upon, but didn't, is Vivian Gus and Paley's book, Wally's Stories. And in there, they were talking about wishes one day, and they were talking about how, or wishes or magical acts or whatever it was. And basically they said, well, that's a hard wish. So God has to do that one. but the tooth fairy could do this other kind of could grant this other kind of lower level wish. So they sort of see God as dealing with the harder wishes and the harder magic, and the tooth fairy, those kinds of beings are dealing with kind of the easier kind of magic.
Great. This will be the last Jackie specific question, and then there's a question in the chat that's kind of prompted a bit of discussion from attendees. So Jackie, I'll put this one to you directly, and then after this question, we'll open it up and I'll put one question to the whole panel. So Jackie, from Rebecca, are you aware of, or would you have any interest in, exploring if there is a correlation between people who reacted to Santa by internalizing belief in Santa as the spirit of Christmas, and therefore play with it without engaging in mythical literalism, and people who are religiously agnostic or identify themselves as spiritual but not religious in later life?
Yeah. Wow. Gosh, that would be a great study, wouldn't it? So many of these studies are just ones that where you want to get kids when they're 3 and then test them again when they're 65. But just kind of speculate. It's just so hard to know sort of what is there a personality trait that, kind of governs all of this? People who are spiritual from the beginning. I just don't know. I don't know how to figure this out. I mean, I just feel like it's a $64,000 question. Where does this like what leads someone to be sort of spiritual in the first place? And what is spiritual? What does that mean? So I can't answer that one. I'm sorry. That's a hard one. Maybe somebody else.
Not an easy one. We might take a little bit of a step back here. So there is a question in the chat that's generated a little bit of discussion. Jackie, I'll ask you to kind of respond to it first, and then just consistent with my screen, I'll ask Rianne, Thalia, Candice, and then I'll offer some thoughts at the end. And I understand that this is a bit of this is a question that's going to require a speculative answer, I think. I wonder, did the reality of historic figure St. Nicholas ever play into children's beliefs or parents' explanations? So I guess in the broader sense for the panel, how do we think about the historicity of Santa in the context of contemporary belief? So Jackie.
Yeah, I mean, it's never come up in any of the kid conversations that I've had. I think sometimes parents do bring it up when they're trying to explain Santa, but probably not as often. And Thalia and Candice probably know more about that. I do think, I teach this stuff, so I think I'm raising a generation of students who know about the history, who know about St. Nicholas. So maybe they'll start talking to their children about it. UT is a big university, so maybe I'm influencing a lot of people. But yeah, I think sometimes parents probably might appeal to this. And again, you guys let me know if you have data on this, but I don't think it's super common because I don't think that many adults even really know about it, at least in the US.
Sure. Rianne, thoughts on the historicity of Santa?
Well, I think in the Dutch myth, there's quite a lot of references and links. And I know that some parents, when they tell their children about the fact that he's not real, they explain that he's based on an historic figure. And that the whole myth is based on that history. So I think the link is there in the Netherlands. But it is only when they find out about it, that's when they learn about the fact that it's based on history. But there's quite a lot of connections and links between sort of the historic figure and the way we celebrate Sinterklaas. Yeah.
Thalia?
Yeah, I was going to say that I do think we've seen some anecdotes from parents who, when they are explaining the reality of Santa Claus, they go back to, well, there was this figure, this religious figure, the saint who gave presents. And so the spirit of Santa, which was mentioned earlier, sort of becomes this tie back to the sort of real figure of Saint Nicholas, and this idea of that sort of the helps the kids with transition. I will say in the United States, for the most part, I would argue that the Santa celebrations are super secular. In fact, I think that often parents think of the two as being completely separated, and therefore sort of don't provide a lot of that additional historical or ties back to the length of the tradition. The Coca-Cola Santa being the sort of way in which he's celebrated now.
Candace, thoughts?
I just pulled up a spreadsheet. So I mentioned that we had these diaries that parents completed for a couple of Christmases, where we would ask them anytime they had during the week, we text them twice a week, and they had to share any conversations they'd had with their kid related to the Santa. Obviously, these are going to have some bias because the parent is recalling what happened, but we do have all that data that we've coded. I searched one of the spreadsheets and I see the name Nicholas mentioned a few times, but not many. Here's an example of once when it's used. We told the children the story of St. Nicholas. Nolan asked how St. Nicholas became Santa Claus. Since St. Nick died, he asked if Santa Claus was really an angel. We told him we think St. Nick was such a good and generous man that when he died, he was rewarded with magic that let him become Santa Claus. Whoa. So they did mention that St. Nicholas, but it wasn't in the child is discovering Santa's not real yet. It was like, here's why the Santa has this kind of magic.
That's great.
But I do think I agree with the others about this not being a common part of the Santa myth for many in cultures that we've studied so far.
Yeah, to offer my own thoughts, I guess the question of what the historicity plays in contemporary beliefs for me is less interesting in like the proximal sense, in the sense that how does it influence a 6-year-old's beliefs today? What I'd be interested in examining is some kind of phylogenetic analysis of like, well, let's take the Santa Claus, Sforte Pita, whatever it is. Let's take all of the Christmas deep, dark winter beliefs and kind of code them for qualities and features, and then kind of track it. And of course, Thalia brought up like the Coca-Cola Santa, which is of course an undeniable cultural influence, but I guess I'd be most interested in kind of tracking what the cultural evolution, like the shape of Santa has been over the last however many 100 years, in what ways mass media like the Coca-Cola campaign has influenced it. Because there are meaningful differences in terms of like in Australia, Santa's kind of a funny thing. So if you're bad, he'll bring you coal. But like that's a weird hangover because in Australia it's summer. So the idea of having coal in your house ever, let alone in high summer, is this weird cultural hangover. And there's even kind of this it would be too rich to call this folklore, but like there's this song, and I think children are still taught this in school, but like when Santa comes to Australia, the reindeers get left behind, and 6 big white albino kangaroos, which we call boomers, 6 white boomers carry Santa. There's a big famous song, you can Google it on YouTube. So I'd just be really interested in just seeing, what the deep time cultural influences are, the influence of mass media, the influence of climate have on these Santa beliefs, and kind of how that manifests in other ways. So yeah, that's me. Okay, so the floor is open. I haven't seen any general questions, so please get to typing. Let's see if there's anything else in these questions here. I guess let's open it while people are composing their thoughts and their messages. I guess any thoughts or anything people want to weigh in on in terms of the speakers on things that Jackie has said, or anything else that's been raised by folk at this point.
I'd actually love to hear Rianne's thought on the alien abductions. And because I think one thing that's really interesting that's come up across lots of talks is how the belief in Santa's magic and supernatural fits into the sort of broader pattern of belief and supernatural entities from God and the powers of God, all the way sort of through the milieu of characters that children and adults engage in. So Rianne, I'm super interested in this alien abduction thought and sort of how that plays into this.
Yeah, I was at a conference in November where Richard McNally was speaking, and it was all about truth and lying. And he presented some older work already about, what kind of people are the people that believe they've been abducted by aliens, what kind of personalities do they have, and what he found in his study was that there was a majority in that group that had not so long ago stopped believing in God. So they were no longer religious, but it appeared like they sort of filled that void of no longer feeling any meaning or like there's some greater good. And they filled that void with the alien abduction. And they also described it as something that they were traumatized by on the one hand, but on the other hand, they said, I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't want it to not have happened because it is for me very meaningful. And it is sort of a comforting thought that they are out there and that they sort of follow us and that I was chosen to be researched and picked up by them. So for them, it filled a void. And I was thinking about that when I heard Jackie talking about, Santa, of course, that belief falling away could also create some sort of void that could be filled with something else, with something other magical, and would that be God or would that be something else? But I can imagine that's also something that could come into play, especially for people that maybe are more sort of longing for that meaning than others.
Yeah, what that makes me think of is one thing Candace and I don't have data on, but is a really interesting question, is whether the subset of people who say they were particularly upset when they stopped believing in Santa Claus, or who had a long emotional reaction to stop believing in Santa Claus, where their religiosity is. Because I wonder if it was this idea of, were they looking for something else to believe in that wasn't there? Were they being raised in families that were less religious, and so there wasn't this sort of other connection or meaning to hold on to? Because we don't have a lot of other sort of information necessarily about we have some broader measures of religiosity, but we don't have a lot about sort of spirituality or belief in that way. So I think that's an interesting question. Candace has already done the analysis.
I didn't do analysis. Because we don't have a specific data, but we did have a few people self-report that the skepticism about Santa caused them to become an atheist.
Yes.
So, but we don't know how widespread other things were beforehand and how strongly the religious beliefs were promoted and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think I've seen that a fair amount too. And I just think that, as I mentioned, this people's sense of control is a big factor in all of this. Like there's this interesting work by Aaron Kay and all of his colleagues about this. And if you think God sort of, controls a lot of things and you lose that, if you think Santa controls a lot of things and you lose that, you maybe need someone to fill that role. And I think it could be God, but it doesn't have to be God. It could be, for a child, it could be like your teacher or your parent. For an adult, it could be the president, or it could be just something more amorphous like government. There are lots of ways that people can, or any kind of supernatural belief can sort of fill that gap. So I think it's a fascinating question. What is the role of uncertainty and feelings of lack of control in all of this?
Can I jump in since we don't have any other questions yet? I think building on this is the idea that kids themselves have different things that they want out of a Santa myth. And there's variability in how they're approaching Santa and how they're approaching religious information and what their goals are. I will be honest and say this comes up partially from a conversation with one of my kids about Santa, where he felt very strongly he wanted to know the truth. And no, I want to know. And it was very clear, if I were to answer him in a misleading way, that he would have held a grudge. And so it's it was fun to play pretend for a while, but at some point earlier than I had anticipated, perhaps he was like, nope, I need to know logic. Chop, chop, tell me the truth. And I think we've all probably heard of examples of kids who like will ask the question like, no, I don't want to know, or they seem like they want to be in that magical world, and that is the goal more than anything else. Some of that, I don't know how much is affected by their feelings about what the parents are doing, and how much of that is a fantasy orientation kind of thing, or a logic orientation kind of thing. I'm not sure. What do others think?
I mean, I wonder, one of the things that we talked about, one of the things that I wonder is how that, like, obviously kids have their own individual personalities and their own individual orientations towards logic or science or magic or evidence. But I wonder too, how much of that ties into the kinds of explanations that parents are giving and the kinds of environments that parents are setting up for their kids. So, you know, we have obviously parents who are engaging in more promotion that is more fantastical in nature. And then we have parents who are maybe giving some Santa promotion or some Santa explanations that are a little more sciencey or logical in nature. And I wonder how the kinds of explanations or the kinds of activities that parents provide for their kids, and therefore the kind of ways of understanding the world that parents are providing for their kids interact with sort of how the kids think the world should be explained, right, in their more logical way versus a more sort of supernatural way. But I think that's just it's another variable to add to the equation, not necessarily like an explanation or a mechanism in and of itself.
Yeah, I'm always curious about individual differences also, you know, so like, let's just throw something out there like the CRT, the cognitive reflection, you know, is that, you know, we can measure that in kids, and our kids who are more, you know, sort of intuitive or just kind of I guess intuitive, are they different in this respect than kids who tend to think, you know, to reflect more, or to think more critically, as measured by the CRT, you know, or are there differences in tolerance of ambiguity, for example? Are there differences in yeah, like uncertainty tolerance, tolerance of ambiguity, or even just getting back to the control issue? I mean, some people are bothered by uncertainty. They don't like it when they feel out of control, and other people are just sort of basically okay with it. Look, I understand the world is random. That's just the way it is. You know, so I always wonder if those traits are, you know, influence this, Candace, the question you raised.
If I may jump in here, I think this is a very fruitful and interesting line of conversation, but we do have a few questions from Rebecca. General comment, so not a question, but a comment, but I think there's meat to chew on here. The talk of folklore has me thinking about how many adults have had the unhappy task of teasing out the nuance in King Arthur or Robin Hood legends to point out that the way they know the stories is mostly fiction. When a character enters folklore, people get attached, much like kids to Santa. I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but it might be a secular alternative to comparing this with religiosity. So how do we entertain secular mythological figures? Thoughts? I might throw to Jackie first, because...
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what the question is, but
rather than comparing Santa to God, could we compare Santa to beliefs in mythical figures like King Arthur, or potentially things like the boogeyman, secular alternatives?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I'm thinking of things like you know, how okay, one thing is sort of, I'm thinking of fiction and the problem of figuring out what aspects of fiction are true and which aspects of fiction aren't. And how when we, you know, kind of enter a fictional world, we're able to try to figure out which parts of it relate to reality, and, you know, it's called the reader's dilemma, but you know, which parts aren't. So I'm kind of thinking about that, and you know, how those kinds of processes are going to operate within fiction, you know.
maybe I'll hand that over to Thalia then, who I know has spent a lot of time thinking about
Mhm.
the topics Jackie's raised there.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of reader's dilemma and what to pull from fictional sources is interesting, because there's also this idea of, once we put the label of legend on it, right? Once we put the label of like the old story or something like that, then you're not making the assumption of truth necessarily, right? You're making the assumption of this might have started somewhere, but it's moved quite a considerable distance from that original source. But I do think that what people get attached to, similarly to Santa, is they get attached to the version of the story that they are most familiar with. So I'm thinking about things like Cinderella being played by women of different racial backgrounds, or allowing for a Robin Hood that is gender nonconforming or gender expansive when played in something like a theatrical context, or when people recast various folklore and various tales. I do think that, similarly to Santa, when you maybe break the Santa myth into pieces, people have this element of the tradition or element of the story that they become attached to, because it's the one that they're familiar with, or it's the one that originally taught them those lessons. And people do get sort of offended or angry when it's not abiding by the sort of version of the story that they're most familiar with, right? Every time Doctor Who gets recast, everybody sort of gets up in arms about who this person is and the version that they like for themselves. I wonder too, though, Tracy Gleason, who I don't think I didn't see her name today, but I know she wanted to come, once said to me, like, isn't Santa just everybody's imaginary companion? Like, isn't Santa Claus just like the imaginary companion that comes around every December and sticks around and holds several characteristics similar to how we know imaginary companions work? So I do think something between myth, story, like beloved character from fiction, Santa's somewhere in that mix.
But I think
Oh,
what Sinterklaas, at least, and I think Santa as well, it stands apart because we meet him in the street. He's there. I mean, the fictional characters are in the books and in the stories, but in many times Sinterklaas is the guy that actually visits your classroom and you can shake his hand. And that is, I think, unique as compared to many of the other fictional characters that we don't meet on a regular basis, once a year.
That's how Jackie and I got started on this work 10 years ago, was going, hey, wait a minute, this is like the guy. Sorry, Rowan, go ahead.
Right. So Rianne, I'd just like to extend the premise of the question a little more for you, or to hear your response on it. So, we are engaging in a kind of deception when it comes to Santa Claus. But when we read a child a book of fables or mythical stories, we wouldn't regard that as deception. Seems like it's a qualitatively different kind of thing. Does the framework you bring to the table here, what do you think about, like, telling the story of Robin Hood, which we know not to be true, but which we might endorse the values of? In what ways would you reflect upon that?
I think it depends on what you do with it as a parent. You can read stories and, I don't know, make it into like pretend like it's real, versus you can make up story. You can leave it to sort of the pretend situation. And I'm thinking about examples of a lie that you want your child to take a bath, and then a family made up a story about we used to have an extra sibling, but he didn't want to take a bath, and then he turned into a frog. and they have pictures of the frog in the family photo albums. For kids, that's real, and you make it into a real story. So I think it really depends on what you do as a parent to go from this is a fictional character in a book or TV, where most parents won't say that, I don't know, Elsa really exists somewhere, lives somewhere in a country where we can go. But as soon as you go across that bridge, I think you you get into the actual lying. So for me, that's the border. And I think it depends on the family where they draw that line. And for some of them, it's very limited. But I also know of families where they have multiple fictional characters and they create multiple fictional stories that young children believe are real.
Mhm. Great. So in the interest of just trying to balance the time with audience questions and then moving into kind of a panel discussion, although I do realize narcissistically that this is already a panel discussion, but there's two questions I want to ask. The first by Alex, the second by Ian. I would invite everyone to send me emails if you have additional questions, and maybe we can circulate them with the speakers, and we can produce a bit of a written document that might complement the recording that we'll release in the next week or so. But a question from Alex. On the previous discussion, in looking at this, I would be cautious with assuming that logic equals closer to disbelief in Santa. I personally remember engaging in Santa in a very logical way and was still very late to finding out he wasn't real because I had produced a lot of logical explanations for his existence. In a way, that made it harder for me to deal with not believing because it rocked my logical worldview. I wonder how common that would be and whether some of these logical kids may find it harder than the fantastical kids for that reason. I might throw it at, Candace first for sure.
Trying to unmute. Okay. So I think I have two things. One is that Andrew Stillman has a paper where he looked at, as kids better understand the distinction between what's plausible and implausible and impossible, how do their questions about Santa change? And he found that basically, as kids get a better understanding of the world, they ask better questions about Santa, but sometimes they can come up with good logical answers for those questions themselves. So I think I hear what you're saying about that connection between logic definitely leads to not believing in Santa. One of the things I would be interested in exploring, though, is that as kids are trying to convince themselves that Santa is real by logical reasoning, what sort of feedback are they getting from others about that? And how is that influencing their thinking? Because if a child came to me and said, I figured out, I think that Santa's not real, or Santa is real because I think he must have just some sort of special jet engine that helps him travel around the world. Parents could respond to that logical guess about what's happening in different kinds of ways. And so it could be worthwhile to look at both of those components. So what kinds of questions are kids asking that are trying to make sense of logic? And then what kind of feedback are they getting from others about their reasoning patterns?
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. And this is something I'm going to touch on a bit more in the next section. But it is logical for children to believe in Santa, I think. I've long argued this, I think, and this, in my study, I brought up this idea of creds, credibility enhancing displays, and that's been used in the religious literature quite as a fairly useful tool. The basic premise is that we should look to people's behavior to understand the degree to which they sincerely hold invisible qualities, and a belief is an invisible quality. So if you look at a Muslim and they're performing salat, they're praying 5 times a day. When it comes to Ramadan, they're going through the fasting procedure. You can read a book by its cover, right? You can infer that there is a sincerity to that belief. And the same is true for Santa, I would argue. Like, parents know they're lying. It is a vast conspiracy, but from the child's point of view, mum and dad say Santa is real. That's deception. But they put the tree up, they put the food out, they put the socks on the mantle or the shoes outside, and they do everything that is absolutely consistent with his underlying belief. So I think it was Alex, was it? I am really sensitive to this, what logical means in this context, because from a social transmission point of view, it is entirely reasonable that children should believe in Santa, certainly up to a certain age. It gets messy after 7, where different kind of cognitive faculties and forms of testimony and evidence come in. But anyone less than 7, it is a child that doesn't believe in Santa for contrarian reasons, despite the overwhelming activity of their parents and siblings and cousins. That would be that's a strange child, I think. If anyone else wants to jump in on the logic question here. Rianne, any thoughts on logic when it comes to uncovering deception?
Not necessarily logic, but I have heard of examples where parents describe that they go shopping together, they buy the gifts, they wrap them together, and they end up in the shoe, and the child still believes that Santa Claus is somehow involved in, even though the parents are trying their hardest to.
Santa Claus works in mysterious ways.
Yeah, so kids believe. I mean, we have also many examples. You probably also have that, where teachers, they change into Santa Claus's clothes in front of the kids.
Yeah.
And they respond as if it is Santa Claus, and when he's gone, they start telling the teacher about who visited. So, I mean, young kids, like you said, I mean, they start believing by themselves. They need very little logic or whatever to start believing, and I'm not sure if logic is also necessarily something that will make them stop believing. So maybe that's sort of a different process, and for some kids it might play some sort of role, but I'm not necessarily if that is the most crucial thing that determines them believing or not believing.
Sure. So let's jump to, I think, the final open floor question here from Ian. I'm curious a bit about broad cultural experiences and have a question for the full panel. So we'll run down the panel here. If you all could ask a question about Santa belief to a nationally representative sample of adults in the country of your choice, what question would you ask? I'll go Jackie, Candace, Thalia, Rianne, and myself. Jackie.
Adults. Oh. I would answer this for kids, but yeah, I just want to know.
Interpret the question as you see fit, I think.
Yeah. No, I mean, since we're just kind of having fun with this, yeah, I guess I would ask them whether their disbelief in Santa affected their belief in God. But I'd just love to be able to ask kids that.
Sure.
Since we're just kind of playing with fun ideas.
Candace.
I'm really interested in a Santa promotion piece that we've talked about so far. And we have that sort of blunt force approach of getting people to check off what activities they've engaged in related to Santa. But I think beyond that, understanding more about how they talk to kids about Santa and how they answer kids' questions. I realize that's a broader thing than just one thing, but I do feel like the way that they're promoting Santa matters. And we've talked about some differences that we know exist so far. And I think that would be meaningful to gather in a more diverse sample. I'll mention again, our study was very white, very college educated and beyond. And so we are missing a lot of perspectives in our initial data set. So it's a place to start, but we need more of that information from others.
Thalia.
Yeah, I think Candace and I often joke that she brings the like critical thinking, scientific thinking component to the place, and I bring the imaginary thinking, imaginary component to the place, to our collaboration. And so my question is the sort of combination of that, or the imaginary side of that, which is how does Santa fit into this sort of broader picture of playful experiences and imaginary experiences that children and adults engage in? So how does it fit into watching TV and reading books and going to the movies, but then also belief in Easter Bunny and Tooth Fairy and witches and aliens and ghosts, and the sort of kind of pretend play that kids and adults engage in, and where does Santa Claus behavior and Santa Claus beliefs sort of fall into all of these other kinds of magical, playful experiences. Did we lose Rowan?
He said he had to be right back, so I think
Okay.
Rianne.
So Rianne, you're up.
Yeah, my turn, right?
Yeah.
I was waiting for my cue. What I am most interested in, or would be most interested in, is actually the sort of parental sensitivity around finding out about Santa. So I think there's multiple options. Either you, so it's a bit related to Candace about the fact, how do children find out and how do these conversations go about Santa? And I think what you can do as a parent, you can be too soon. So the first critical question, you might already drop the message, but maybe your child is not ready for it, or you can keep on making up stories and keep your child into the myth, even though they're all ready to find out. So I would want to get an idea of sort of the parental sensitivity in when the news was dropped and how that relates to the experience of children, the feelings, the trustworthiness of parents. So I think that would be crucial to get an idea of where these parents are. Are they sort of timely? As parenting scientists, I would say like sensitive, responsive reaction. You're timely with your response, or too soon or too late. And my hypothesis would be that too soon versus too late both has negative consequences.
Yeah, if I had the funding or the magic power to ask the question, I think what would interest me most is domains of concern or domains of authority. So there's really interesting work in particularly non-weird cultures and pantheistic, polytheistic cultures where spirits have domains of a geographic region, like a forest or a river or something, or domains of concern over a particular set of behaviors, like sexual behaviors or deceptive behaviors or whatever, what have you. So I'd be really interested in trying to unpack the moral authority of Santa with children. We have asked them what they think nice and naughty means, but it was a kind of a throwaway question at the end of a different survey just to kind of see what's out there. And to the best of my knowledge, if anyone in the audience has seen research, if it's anthropological or sociological or something, like, what does Santa care about? not his epistemics, but like, what is he looking for when he's looking to put you on a nice list or a naughty list or something? So, okay, we're coming to the end. We've got about 20 minutes left. It's amazing so many people are still here. I will put out a wee call to please provide a little feedback. I just dropped a link in the chat. Any feedback can help me or all of us kind of make claims about outreach and promotion cases and stuff. As I think the most junior member of the panel, please help me. It would be nice to be promoted soon. So I guess we're at the final point here where with 20 minutes left, the five of us might offer some concluding thoughts. I hope everyone might accept me jumping in first to kind of set a little bit of tone, spend a couple of minutes on this, and then we'll kind of go through. And just before I do, as I said before, do email me, I think is the easiest way, and I can speak to the other speakers, and we can, if there's any outstanding questions that are burning, I'll put that to them and we can try and return that to you with the video recording. I don't know if it's still happening, but Carthage College, someone there was live streaming us to their dev site class. So like, awesome. Hello. I hope that someone in that class has a way of accessing me and we can kind of pass that on. If there's anyone else out there doing something similar, it'd be fantastic to know. So please reach out. Thank you, Brandy, at the beginning when you were trying to rescue us for Discord. That was much appreciated. The Discord will be open for a couple of hours, but I will be deleting it just because we don't need it to exist. So if you do want to reach out to any of the speakers, emails is probably the best way to go. It's all easily found on our institutional sites. So yeah, these are fascinating talks. I'm really glad everyone had the time and opportunity to come here. The thing that jumps out at me and I hope this is not too gushing, but like I met Jackie about 10 years ago, 9 or 10 years ago, and her work has really influenced how I think about supernatural beings. I am at heart, or at least through my PhD program and onwards, I've been a scholar of ritual, how rituals change how we perceive the world. And Jackie wrote a number of papers, one of which, almost in a throwaway claim, was like, ritual is a special form of testimony. And I really haven't seen enough people take that idea seriously. I really think it's at the heart of a lot of my research questions. Not to diminish anyone else's questions, I just think this is a really good question. And Jackie has a paper with Berger and some others, 2 papers actually, on the Candy Witch. And this is a woefully undercited paper. It's been around, I won't date you, Jackie, but it's been around long enough that it should have 10 times the number of citations it currently has. It's fantastic. It's one of the strongest cases of creating belief in a fictional, in a supernatural agent. And it's fascinating. And so a thing that really jumps out at me that's been raised by well, everyone in degrees, was the role of ritual in creating the role of ritual as a special form of testimony, whether it's credibility modeling behaviors, or whether it's the totally symbolic stuff like trees. And it's really nice to see some of the things that popped up in like Candace's work and others that kind of touched on that. I'd also like to say, I think, so Thalia, just nod if this is true, but Candace and Thalia, you're working off the same research together, aren't you? Yeah. That the research Candace presented, that's obviously the both of yours, was fantastic. I spent like 3 hours the other day searching for like, where's the data on parents reporting if they believed in Santa as a child? And then it's right here in front of me now. So it's so great to see that. I think the other work there in Candace's stuff about like feeling prideful or happy or sad, I mean, as a scholar of ritual, imagistic rituals that occur infrequently but are intensely emotional, Christmas is a really interesting example of that. And they kind of fall into positive or negatively valenced emotions. But there's really no such thing as a positive ritual. If you consider like a marriage ceremony, everyone says, happiest day of my life. But then you ask them, like, how did you feel before marriage? And like, I was so nervous, I nearly threw up. Like, that's a negative emotion, right? And then in hindsight, we reflect upon this complex milieu and develop significant meaning behind it. And I was just really prompted by Candace and Thalia's work there on like, yeah, I bet it's a complex mix of positive and negative emotions, which as children and adolescents, we probably reflect upon. I have terrible childhood amnesia. So I never remember believing in Santa, despite the fact I'm sure I did, but I have no introspection on that. But I don't know, there seemed to be so much fascinating work here. Stuff I felt like we all converged on some really interesting evidence and ideas, despite our relatively diverse approach to these questions. And yeah, I don't know. Yeah, let's do a special issue or something. There's so much interesting stuff here. And it strikes me this is a really sincere attempt at legitimizing the study of Santa. So those are my kind of concluding thoughts, and I'm very positive about everything that's been presented. Who would like to offer concluding thoughts next? Jackie, please.
I'll go next just because I want to kind of throw it back at you. I've been, doing work in this field or around this field for, well, okay, I'll date myself, like 30 years now or something. And I'm thinking about when I'm going to retire. And I can't tell you how happy it makes me to know that there's this whole group of really brilliant, energetic junior scholars who are doing this work. And it just makes me so happy to know that. And, with regard to what I talked about today, sort of concluding thoughts, the first time I read that people, particularly fundamentalist Christians, didn't want their kids to believe in Santa because they thought it would affect belief in God, I was just absolutely fascinated. I've kind of been obsessed with this question for about 20 years, and I've never actually done this study for lots of reasons. It's a hard study to do, as you guys all know. But, I guess my hope is that by throwing out all these ideas today, that maybe someone will figure this out, do the empirical work. I think I'm probably like at this point letting go of the idea of actually doing that study perhaps, but I hope somebody will do this work. And I also just wanted to bring up, there's an interesting question. Of course, I'm biased because Jenny Nissel is one of my collaborators, but there's a very interesting question in the chat that Jenny throws out, which is basically how do we, we've been talking all day today about belief and disbelief almost as if it's binary. And it's obviously not, and the way I talk to my students is that it's kind of a continuum. Like we have this continuum from real to not real, and we place entities and things like somewhere on that continuum. And depending upon things like religiosity or, I don't know, creativity or skepticism or whatever, we put things in different places. So I might put Santa way up here now, but I put Santa way here when I was a kid or whatever. So I feel like there's a continuum, and I feel like we often, I tell my students to just kind of keep the door open. Of course, there is a great quote that says, it's important to have an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out, which I love. But basically kind of, keep an open mind about things. And with regard to the distinction between, like believing and not believing, I just think it's a continuum. But then a hard line between suspension of disbelief and belief is like a really great thing to think about. And it makes me think about various like philosophers I've talked, new young philosophers have talked about this, like Eric Schwitzgebel talks about like partial belief, kind of half belief, when you could sort of half believe in something, and what is that? And how might we get at that? Or like Tamar Gendler talks about a-leaf, and maybe when you're reading a book and you suspend disbelief, that's kind of like a-leaf in the sense that you on some level that things aren't true, but you feel as if they are, so maybe that's kind of one, and maybe the difference between, suspension of disbelief and belief has something to do with how they do or don't lead to behavior, how they lead to, how they are pulled out of the fiction into the real world, basically. But I just wanted to bring up that question because I think it's so important to our investigation of these issues. And thanks again for organizing all of this.
No problem. Candace, please.
Thank you. I'll be quick. I'll mention that one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot more today, partially based on research Thalia and I have done related to what counts as lying, or how do parents approach talking to things with their kids, partly based on Rianne's work that she talked about today related to categories of lies, but also related to some work that Gail Heyman did, and I saw her name on the list. Gail's done some wonderful work related to how parents approach lying and what sort of diversity there is and what counts as a lie. I am fascinated by that, both from the perspective of how parents are perceiving it and how kids are perceiving it. So I'll just mention this anecdote. When I found out that Santa was not real, it was from somebody at the mall. It was the person who wrapped the gifts, because back in the old days, you could get your gifts wrapped at the shopping mall before you brought them home. So I was with my mom. This woman noticed I was oldish. I was in second grade, and she said something about how Santa wasn't real. And then like, oh, did she know that? Did you know that? And I said, yes. But my face, I could just feel my face turning pink. And I remember afterwards struggling with that a lot and feeling like my parents had deceived me, but they tried very hard to talk about the myth of Santa Claus. Like they tried not to say that Santa was a real being, but trying to frame it as like, well, there's a story and blah, blah, blah. I mean, they would lie some probably, but I just remember feeling violated, but they felt like they were doing the right thing. And so it's made me think more, this conversation made me think more about what parents think they're doing and how kids are perceiving that. I see Gail's raised her hand. Hey, Gail.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I don't have a great Santa story, but I probably those of us who have dramatic stories, that's one of the reasons we got into this. And for me, it was the Tooth Fairy. I really believed in the Tooth Fairy. I love the Tooth Fairy. And I remember, I've told this story before, but I remember when I was in kindergarten, like my classmates saying there is no Tooth Fairy and challenging me, and me just like defending the Tooth Fairy to the class. And then as I was trying to defend the Tooth Fairy, I realized my arguments made no sense, that I couldn't defend it. And that's when I went home and asked my dad, I'm like, is there really a Tooth Fairy? And I just felt so humiliated in front of my class. I was afraid to go back. So yeah, it's interesting, like all these different pathways people can take through learning these kinds of information. But thank you guys. I'm also with Jackie on being excited of having this new generation and new energy to sort of figure out new methods and new questions and really build on things. So great. Thank you guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Gail. Thalia, I might give you the final word as co-organizer. So I'll jump to Rianne first, and then you can offer your concluding thoughts. So Rianne, where are you at?
I thought it was wonderful to be part of this this group and this symposium. And I've been working on parental lying now for about 2.5 years. So I'm quite new in that. And I in those, actually this year only I found out that there's a whole group that is studying Santa from a whole different perspective, and so I've been just fascinated by hearing all these different perspectives and the different ways that you can look at this subject and the different angles and how rich it is, even though many people see it as a very niche, kind of small, funny subject to be bothering yourself with as a researcher. But I think today showed how much more there is to explore and how many different angles there are. And I just fascinated by hearing all the stories and learning a lot from you and all the people that with their questions and super good remarks. So I've been enjoying myself a lot this late afternoon / evening for me.
Yes, it's getting a bit on for you, isn't it? And finally, Thalia, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I again, I echo what's been said about the sort of richness of what was presented today. And I actually was just thinking I'm looking forward to going back and watching the recording to really sort of get into the depth and detail of the different talks. I want to come back to something that Jackie said, because it was exactly what I was thinking about. And also this comment in the chat from Rebecca, of the Venn diagram of reality, fact, and truth being a big ball of wibbly wobbly, timey wimey stuff. That maybe Santa is the doctor because only the TARDIS could get to every house in one night. I do think that there's a lot to unpack about the difference between behaviors and rituals that look like belief in the supernatural, actual belief in the supernatural, and then sort of playing at belief because it's fun or a game or a way to build community or a way to try things on in that safe space of fiction. When I was a student many years ago at this point, and I was first learning about the scientific study of pretend and the scientific study of imagination, one of the things that struck me over and over again was how convinced parents were that kids had no idea what was going on, and how convinced that a lot of the sort of early writing on pretend and imagination, from Freud to Piaget, right, was really, and Vygotsky a bit too, was really about this idea that kids are confused and they have no idea what's going on and they're behaving as if it's all real. But when you start to ask them in systematic ways and really try to break down what it is they actually think is true, you know, the child knows the difference between their imaginary companion and their best friend from preschool and their mom and the person they see on TV. And a lot of it has to do with how you ask the question, right? And do you do the direct comparison between, well, is your imaginary companion the same as Brendan from your kindergarten class, or are they different from Brendan from your kindergarten class? And so I think one thing that I think we didn't quite touch upon in this symposium, but I do think is going to start to come to the forefront as we continue to explore the best way to ask these questions, is that I think we're going to get a lot more fine-grained into what that belief actually looks like, where kids are using their logic to believe in things in the same way that they believe in the science of their everyday world, where they're still doing this as a playful engagement with other people, and how they're going to come to those conclusions and those trajectories. So I'm just super excited that we started asking these questions. I love the data that's been developed and discovered so far. And I'm really excited to see how in 10 years, in 5 years, in 3 years, the richness of the method is going to continue to increase as we continue to fine tune the best way to ask these questions over time, the best way to get around some of the sticky issues when it comes to religion and parents and IRBs and all of these other things. I remember Jackie and I writing our first Santa IRB and just being terrified they weren't going to let us ask anything at all, with redlining through questions. So I think, you know, that's one of the things I'm going to be bringing from today, is like, how do we keep working the methods and working the ways in which we ask the questions and the time spans to really get at the fact that the line between truth and belief and fiction and imagination isn't so one or the other on each side.
Fantastic. So some very final housekeeping thoughts. Again, feedback is valuable. Please, if you have 30 seconds, go for it. I would invite the speakers, we'll go back to Discord, to the secret space and just have a quick debrief. I'd like to invite my MSc student just to introduce you to all. So if you have MScs or PhDs in the audience, please bring them into that little chat as well. Everyone, thank you so much for being here. Like I said at the beginning in emails, Thalia and I expected a dozen grad students, but we've had 55, 60 people here for the vast amount of time. And that's just crazy. That just blows me away. Will this be run next year? I think that would be fun. I would, of course, invite all the speakers back. If you're a grad student or someone in that realm, Malia, I'm looking at you, my MSc student. If you're a grad student, reach out in 6 to 8 months' time. We ran this on a zero budget. It cost about £25 all up to run. I would be happy to do something like this again next year. So if you do want to speak on this topic from a psychological or a sociological and anthropological angle, be in contact, I think. And otherwise, if you have outstanding questions that are really burning, email me. I'll put them out to the speaking team. And in the next week, I'll get the recording of Thalia and edit it a little bit and return it to everyone who's registered. So just finally, thank you to all the speakers. It was amazing we all found the time across multiple time zones. Thank you to everyone who attended. And at least for me, it's 7 o'clock on a Friday night. So please go and have a nice drink and enjoy yourself. And Merry Christmas, I guess, as a final concluding thought. Merry Christmas. Go forth and lie and spread joy. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
I'll jump to the Discord.
All right, I'm going to keep the meeting open until everyone pops off. All right, anyone else have a last comment or question before I close the meeting? All right, thank you all so much for coming today. Really appreciate it.